Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a question that haunts the dark corners of the 41st millennium, a question whispered in the barracks of 1,000 different worlds and debated in the war rooms of generals who have seen more death than most civilizations will ever produce. In a galaxy where faith is measured in blood and devotion is proven only through suffering, where entire planets burn in the name of a god who sits silent upon a golden throne, where billions march to their deaths singing hymns they barely understand. What does it truly mean to be fanatical? Think about that for a moment. Let it settle into your mind like smoke filling a room. Because in the universe of Warhammer 40,000, fanaticism is not the exception. It is the rule. It is the very foundation upon which the Imperium of man has built its crumbling, magnificent, horrifying civilization. Every regiment of the Astra Militarum carries within it some measure of zealous devotion. Every world that tithes its sons and daughters to the Emperor's wars does so with a fervor that would make the most extreme movements in human history look tame by comparison. The Katashans fight with the reckless abandon of people who grew up on a planet where every single organism was designed to kill them. The Talan Desert Raiders carry the memory of their poisoned world like a scar across their collective soul, and they fight with a fury born of that ancient wound. The Vostroyan Firstborn march to war, burdened by a debt of honor so old that the original sin has become more myth than memory, yet still they bleed for it. The Mordian Iron Guard stand in perfect formation while the galaxy crumbles around them. Their discipline, a kind of madness all its own. And yet, when commanders of the Imperial Guard gather around strategic hololith displays and speak of fanaticism in hushed tones, when veterans who have fought alongside dozens of different regiments compare the fire they have witnessed burning in the eyes of soldiers from world after world, when the question is raised about which regiment carries devotion to its absolute, most terrifying, most awe-inspiring extreme, there is one name that surfaces above all others. One name spoken with a mixture of reverence and unease that tells you everything you need to know about the soldiers who bear it. The death cause of Krieg. Say the name aloud and feel the weight of it on your tongue. Death cause. Not a regiment that happens to deal in death, but a corps for whom death itself is the organizing principle, the highest aspiration, the closest thing to salvation that their broken world and broken souls will ever know. These are not soldiers who fight despite their fear of dying. These are soldiers who fight because dying is the only thing that can wash away a stain so deep that 500 years of uninterrupted warfare could not cleanse it. These are men and women, though the distinction barely matters beneath those iconic gas masks, who have been raised from birth to believe that their lives are already forfeit, that every breath they draw is borrowed from a debt that can never truly be repaid, that the only honorable act left to their bloodline is to spend that borrowed life in the most useful way possible, which is to say, in the service of the Emperor, and preferably in the manner of their ending. To understand the death cause of Krieg, you must first understand that they are not merely brave. Bravery implies a choice, a moment where fear presents itself and is overcome by will or duty or love. The death cause have moved beyond bravery into something else entirely, something that does not have a comfortable name in any human language because it was never meant to be a human trait. They have achieved a state of complete indifference to their own survival that goes far deeper than courage. It is woven into their culture, their training, their very genetics. A Krieg soldier does not overcome the fear of death because a Krieg soldier was never permitted to develop that fear in the first place. From the moment they draw their first breath in the underground complexes of their blasted, as irradiated homeworld, they are taught that their existence is a mistake that can only be corrected through sacrifice. They are raised knowing that their ancestors committed the most unforgivable sin in the Imperium's long and bloody catalogue of sins, the sin of turning away from the Emperor's light, and that every generation since has been born carrying the weight of that betrayal like chains around their necks. This is what makes them the most fanatical regiment in the galaxy. Not their skill, though their skill in siege warfare is nearly unmatched. Not their equipment, though their trench coats and gas masks and heavy artillery have become some of the most recognizable silhouettes in the Imperium's vast military machine. Not even their willingness to take casualties that would break any other regiment 10 times over, though that willingness is legendary and terrifying in equal measure. What makes them the most fanatical is the why of it all, the reason behind the madness, the guilt that drives every charge, every bombardment, every silent march through no man's land towards certain destruction. They fight because they are ashamed. They die because they believe they deserve to. And they do it all with a quiet, implacable, mechanical determination that makes even the Space Marines of the Adeptus Astartes pause and take notice. There are records scattered throughout the Imperium's vast archives of Space Marine captains expressing something close to admiration for the Death Corps, not for their tactical brilliance or their superhuman abilities, because they possess neither, but for the sheer, unreasonable, magnificent stubbornness of their devotion. A devotion that asks nothing in return. A devotion that expects no reward, no recognition, no glory. A devotion that seeks only the opportunity to die well, and in dying, to erase one small fraction of a sin committed centuries before any of them were born. But to truly understand how a regiment like this came to exist, how an entire world could produce generation after generation of soldiers who welcome death the way other soldiers welcome leave, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to travel across the stars to a world that was once beautiful and prosperous, a jewel in the Imperium's crown, before it became the scorched, irradiated, toxic hellscape that gives the Death Corps their name and their purpose. You have to understand what Krieg was before you can comprehend what Krieg became, and why the soldiers it produces are the way they are. So settle in, get comfortable, because this is not a short story, and it is not a simple one. This is the tale of a world that betrayed everything it was supposed to stand for, and the centuries of blood and ash and suffering that followed. This is the tale of men and women who were born into guilt and raised for slaughter, who marched to war wearing the faces of the dead and carrying weapons designed for a kind of fighting that most civilizations abandoned millennia ago. This is the tale of the Death Corps of Krieg, and if you listen closely, you might hear in their story something that echoes far beyond the fictional boundaries of a tabletop game and into the very real questions about duty, sacrifice, identity, and what it means to carry a burden that was never yours to bear. Well, let us begin where all stories of Krieg must begin, with the world itself, in the days before the fires came and burned everything clean. The Astra Militarum, known in older texts as the Imperial Guard, is the single largest military force in the history of any species in the galaxy. The numbers are so vast that the human mind cannot truly process them. We are not talking about millions of soldiers, or even billions. We are talking about an institution that recruits, trains, equips, and deploys soldiers from 1 million different worlds, each one contributing regiments numbered in the tens or hundreds of thousands. The total number of men and women serving in the Astra Militarum at any given time is a figure so large that the Administratum, the vast bureaucratic apparatus that theoretically manages the Imperium's affairs, has long since given up trying to maintain an accurate count. There are regiments fighting on worlds so distant that the orders deploying them were issued before the soldiers currently carrying them out were even born. There are supply convoys traveling through the warp that are delivering ammunition to battlefields that fell silent decades ago. The scale is beyond comprehension, and that is by design. Because in a galaxy where the enemies of mankind are numberless, where every star might hide a threat capable of extinguishing entire civilizations, the only answer the Imperium has ever found is to meet that numberless horde with one of its own. Within this ocean of humanity, each regiment carries with it the culture, the traditions, the strengths, and the scars of its homeworld. when the jungle fighters of Katakan are shaped by a planet so lethal that simply surviving childhood is considered a military qualification. The ice warriors of Valhalla are forged in the frozen wastelands of their homeworld and carry that cold endurance into every battle they fight. The Cadian shock troops, before the fall of their legendary world, were considered the gold standard of the Imperial Guard, professional soldiers raised from birth on a planet that sat in the very shadow of the Eye of Terror, trained from childhood to stand firm against the horrors that leaked from that wound in reality. Every regiment is a reflection of the world that birthed it, and every world tells a different story about what it means to serve the Emperor. But among all these regiments, among all these worlds and all these stories, the death corps of Krieg occupy a unique and deeply unsettling position. Because while most regiments fight for something, for their homeworld, for their honor, for the promise of glory or the fear of punishment, the death corps fight against something. They fight against themselves, against the memory of what their ancestors did, against the stain that they believe marks their very souls. Every other regiment in the Astra Militarum, no matter how brave or how fanatical, still operates within the normal parameters of human motivation. Soldiers fight because they want to live, or because they want to protect their homes, or because they want to earn recognition, or because they fear the consequences of failure. The Death Corps have stripped all of those motivations away, leaving only the raw, a burning core of guilt and the singular desire to atone for it through the most complete sacrifice possible. This makes them, in the eyes of most Imperial commanders, the perfect soldiers. They follow orders without question. They advance into fire without hesitation. They hold positions until the last soldier falls, and they never ever retreat unless explicitly commanded to do so, and sometimes not even then. They do not break under bombardment. They do not waver in the face of charges that would send other regiments streaming to the rear in panic. They do not negotiate. They do not surrender, and they do not expect to survive. They are, in the most literal sense possible, already dead. They simply haven't stopped moving yet. But this perfection comes at a cost that few outside Krieg truly understand. Or because to create a soldier who does not fear death, you must first create a person who does not value life, and that process leaves marks on the soul that no amount of prayer or medication can heal. The Death Corps are not fearless in the way that heroes are fearless. They are fearless in the way that the already condemned are fearless. There is a difference, and it is a difference that sits at the heart of everything we are about to explore together. So as we stand at the threshold of this story, looking out across the blasted wasteland of a world that destroyed itself in the name of redemption, remember this. The Death Corps of Krieg are not simply the most fanatical regiment in the Imperium. They are the most fanatical regiment because they have to be. Because the alternative, the possibility that their ancestors' sin might go unpaid, that the debt might never be settled, that Krieg might remain forever stained by the mark of betrayal, is more terrifying to them than any enemy the galaxy has ever produced. Death is not a punishment for the soldiers of Krieg. Death is a privilege, and that single terrible truth is what makes them unlike anything else in the 41st millennium. Now, let us go back. Let us travel to Krieg as it once was, before the rebellion, before the atomic fire, before the gas masks and the trenches, and the endless, grinding, glorious, horrible war that gave birth to the most devoted soldiers humanity has ever known. Krieg was, once upon a time, a world that most Imperial citizens would have envied. Picture it in your mind as it existed before the catastrophe. A hive world, yes, but not one of the grim, overcrowded, pollution-choked nightmares that the term usually conjures. Krieg was prosperous. Its hive cities rose from the surface of a world that still knew the color green, that still felt the warmth of its sun through an atmosphere that had not yet been poisoned beyond recovery. The people of Krieg lived, by Imperial standards, comfortable lives. They worked in manufactorums that produced goods for the wider Imperium. They worshipped the Emperor in cathedrals that gleamed with gold leaf and stained glass. They raised their children with the expectation that those children would grow up to live similar lives, contributing to the Imperium's vast machine in the quiet, unremarkable way that most Imperial citizens did. The planet sat within Segmentum Tempestus, one of the 5 great administrative divisions of the Imperium, and it fulfilled its obligations to Terra with the reliability that the Administratum valued above almost all other qualities. Krieg paid its tithes. It provided its regiments of soldiers when called upon to do so. It maintained its infrastructure and kept its population productive. In the grand ledgers of the Imperium, Krieg was a world that caused no problems and required no special attention. It was, in the most bureaucratic sense of the word, functional. And in an Imperium that stretched across 1,000,000 worlds and struggled daily against threats that would have obliterated lesser civilizations, functional was high praise indeed. But beneath that functional surface, beneath the hum of manufactorums and the drone of daily prayers and the steady rhythm of a society that seemed to have found its equilibrium, something was shifting. Something was growing in the shadows of Krieg's hive cities, in the private chambers of its ruling elite, in the whispered conversations that took place behind closed doors and encrypted Vox channels. It was the oldest and most dangerous of all human impulses, the desire for more power, more autonomy, more control over the destiny of a world that had always been content to serve, but whose leaders had begun to wonder what it might mean to rule. The Imperium of man, for all its power and all its reach, has always been vulnerable to this particular weakness. Its very size works against it. When a world sits light years from Terra, when orders from the Administratum take decades or even centuries to arrive, when the nearest military force, capable of enforcing compliance, is engaged in a war on the other side of the galaxy, as the temptation to slip the leash grows strong, history is littered with the wreckage of worlds that listened to that temptation. Some turned to chaos, seduced by the whispered promises of the dark gods. Others simply decided that they could govern themselves better than the distant, faceless bureaucracy that claimed authority over their lives. The result was almost always the same: rebellion, followed by repression, followed by the kind of devastating punishment that the Imperium reserves for those who dare to question its right to rule. Krieg's fall followed this pattern, but with a twist that would make it unique in the annals of Imperial history. Because on Krieg, the rebellion did not come from the people. It came from the top. It came from the very individual who had been entrusted with the planet's governance. The leader known as the Autarch, whose name has been deliberately expunged from all Imperial records as a final act of condemnation. We do not know what this person was called, and the Imperium has made certain that we never will. They have been reduced to a title and a crime, nothing more. The Autarch, the betrayer, the one who turned an entire world away from the Emperor's light. What drove the Autarch to rebellion is a matter of speculation. The Imperial records that survive the catastrophe that followed are fragmentary and often contradictory, colored by the biases of the victors and the desperate need to impose a narrative on events that may have been far more complex than any simple story of treachery and redemption. Some accounts suggest that the Autarch had been corrupted by agents of the ruinous powers. That demonic whispers had slowly eroded their faith until rebellion seemed not only reasonable, but righteous. Other accounts paint a more mundane picture of political ambition run amok, of a leader who saw an opportunity to seize greater power during a period when the Imperium was distracted by wars on other fronts, and believed that Krieg could survive, even thrive, outside the Imperium's suffocating embrace. Whatever the reason, the Autarch's rebellion was not a spontaneous uprising. It was planned, carefully, methodically, with the patience that only someone who controlled an entire world's bureaucratic apparatus could muster. Over a period that may have spanned years or even decades, the Autarch consolidated power, replacing key military and civilian leaders with loyalists, diverting resources from Imperial tithes into hidden stockpiles, building a network of supporters who shared the vision of an independent Krieg, free from Terra's demands. By the time the rebellion was openly declared, The Autarch controlled the majority of Krieg's military forces, its communication networks, and its industrial infrastructure. The planet's defenses, once designed to protect it from external threats, were turned inward, ready to crush any internal opposition that might arise. And opposition did arise, because not everyone on Krieg was willing to turn their back on the Emperor. The loyalists who resisted the Autarch's rebellion were a minority, but they were a significant one. They included elements of the Planetary Defense Force who refused to follow orders they considered treasonous, members of the ecclesiarchy who saw the rebellion as heresy against the God Emperor, and ordinary citizens who felt the cold dread of knowing that their world had just painted a target on itself, that the Imperium would eventually, inevitably, come to strike. These loyalists were scattered, disorganized, and vastly outnumbered. Their situation, by any rational military assessment, was hopeless. But among them was a man whose name would become synonymous with both salvation and damnation. A man who would make a decision so extreme, so devastating, so utterly irreversible, that its consequences would reshape Krieg for the next 10,000 years and beyond. His name was Colonel Jurten, and he was the commander of one of Krieg's loyalist garrison forces. What we know of Jurten before the rebellion is sparse. He was a career military officer, incompetent enough to have risen to the rank of colonel, but not distinguished enough to have attracted the kind of attention that would have made him a target for the Autarch's political purges. He was, by all indications, the kind of soldier that the Imperial Guard produces by the millions, dedicated, professional, and utterly unremarkable. The rebellion changed all of that. When the Autarch declared independence and the majority of Krieg's military fell into line behind the new regime, Jurten found himself commanding one of the few loyalist forces capable of organized resistance. He also found himself staring at a military situation that was, by any conventional measure, unwinnable. The Autarch's forces controlled the major hive cities, the industrial centers, the orbital defense platforms, and most of the planet's heavy weaponry. Jurten had a garrison force, a handful of loyal officers, and the knowledge that help from the Imperium, if it came at all, would take years or decades to arrive. A lesser officer might have surrendered. A more cautious one might have attempted a guerrilla campaign, hiding in the wastelands between hive cities and striking at the Autarch's forces when opportunity allowed. A more political one might have tried to negotiate, bargaining loyalty for some guarantee of survival until Imperial forces could relieve them. But Colonel Jurten did none of these things. Colonel Jurten looked at the world that had betrayed the Emperor, the hive cities that had turned their backs on 10,000 years of faithful service, the people who had allowed themselves to be led astray by a traitor's promises, and when he made a decision that would define Krieg for all eternity. He launched the nuclear weapons, not at the enemy, not at specific military targets, at everything. Colonel Jurten initiated a nuclear bombardment of such scope and ferocity that it effectively ended Krieg as a living world. The atomic fire fell upon the hive cities that had declared for the Autarch, but it did not stop there. It fell upon the surrounding territories, upon the agricultural zones that fed the population, upon the water processing plants that kept the world habitable, upon the atmosphere itself, which was poisoned by the fallout to the point where unprotected human life became impossible on the surface. In a matter of hours, Colonel Jurten transformed Krieg from a prosperous hive world into a blasted, irradiated wasteland more closely resembling the surface of a dead moon than anything that had ever supported human civilization. The cost was beyond calculation. The civilian casualties alone numbered in the billions. Entire hive cities were reduced to radioactive rubble, their populations incinerated or condemned to slow death by radiation poisoning. The biosphere of Krieg, never particularly robust given the demands of its industrial civilization, collapsed entirely. The skies darkened with the ash of a burning world, and the rains that followed were toxic enough to eat through unprotected skin. In the space of a single day, Colonel Jurten had killed more people than most wars claim in their entire duration. And he did it, knowing exactly what he was doing. This was not a miscalculation. This was not a weapon that exceeded its intended yield or struck an unintended target. This was a deliberate, calculated, systematic destruction of his own world, carried out in the name of the Emperor and in the service of a simple, brutal logic. If Krieg could not be held for the Imperium, then Krieg would be destroyed, and the Autarch's rebellion would have nothing to rule over. Better a dead world loyal to the Emperor than a living one that served a traitor. The aftermath of the nuclear bombardment was not the end of the story. It was, impossibly, the beginning. Because while the atomic fire destroyed the world's ability to sustain life on the surface, it did not destroy the deeply buried hive infrastructure that riddled Krieg's crust. The people of Krieg, both loyalists and rebels, survived in the underground complexes that had always existed beneath the hive cities, sealed away from the toxic surface world in the same way that submarine crews are sealed away from the crushing depths of the ocean. And down there, in the dark, surrounded by the rubble of their civilization and the knowledge of what had been done to their world, the war continued. What followed was something that the galaxy had rarely seen, even in its long and blood-soaked history. A civil war that would last for 500 years, fought entirely in the trenches and tunnels of a dead world, between two sides who had nowhere to go and nothing left to fight for except principle. The rebels fought to survive, to hold on to whatever fragment of independence they could maintain in the ruins of the world they had helped destroy. What the loyalists fought for redemption, for the chance to prove that Krieg's betrayal had been an aberration, that the true soul of the planet still burned with faith in the Emperor. And both sides fought with a desperation born of the knowledge that there would be no rescue, no relief, no end to the conflict until one side or the other had been completely and utterly destroyed. This was the crucible that forged the Death Corps, not a training program, not a doctrine written in some administratum office on a distant world. The 500-year civil war of Krieg, fought in the mud and the ash and the irradiated darkness of a world that had already died, fought by generation after generation of soldiers who were born into the trenches, lived their entire lives in the trenches, and died in the trenches without ever knowing what sunlight looked like or what clean air tasted like. This was the forge, and what emerged from it was something the galaxy had never seen before and would never see again. But before we enter those trenches, before we breathe in the ash-choked air and feel the trembling of the earth as artillery bombardments shake the dead world to its foundations, let us understand the full weight of what Colonel Yurton's decision meant. Because it was not simply a military action, it was a moral statement written in nuclear fire across the face of a world, and it said something about the nature of loyalty and devotion that would echo through the centuries and shape the souls of every soldier who would ever wear the uniform of the Death Corps. Yurton did not simply destroy the rebels. He destroyed everything. He destroyed the innocent along with the guilty. He destroyed the future of his world along with its present. He destroyed whatever chance Krieg had of returning to the prosperous, comfortable existence it had known before the rebellion. And he did it willingly, knowingly, with the understanding that this was the price of loyalty. This was what it cost to serve the Emperor in a galaxy where half measures and compromises were luxuries that could not be afforded. This was the lesson that would be burned into the collective memory of Krieg, the lesson that would be taught to every child born in the underground complexes for the next 10,000 years and beyond. The Emperor demands everything, and everything is what you give. That is the foundation upon which the Death Corps was built. Not strategy, not tactics, not equipment or training or leadership. Guilt. Guilt and the desperate, all-consuming need to make amends for a sin so vast that no amount of blood could ever truly wash it away. But that would not stop them from trying. It would never stop them from trying. The nuclear fires of Krieg burned for months. The initial bombardment was catastrophic enough, turning the upper layers of the hive cities into molten slag and filling the atmosphere with enough radioactive particulates to blot out the sun for years. But the secondary effects were, in many ways, worse. The destruction of the atmospheric processing plants meant that whatever breathable air remained on the surface was being slowly poisoned by the fallout. The destruction of the water purification systems meant that the underground aquifers, once the lifeblood of Krieg's population, became contaminated with levels of radiation that made them unusable without extensive filtration. The destruction of the agricultural zones, the hydroponic farms, the protein reclamation facilities, meant that the survivors were immediately confronted with the prospect of starvation on a scale that dwarfed even the casualties of the bombardment itself. And yet they survived, both sides, because human beings are, when pressed to the absolute limit of their endurance, remarkably difficult to kill. The rebels retreated into the deepest levels of the hive infrastructure, sealing themselves behind blast doors and radiation shields, rationing whatever supplies they had managed to stockpile before the bombardment. The Loyalists did the same, digging deeper, building new shelters, converting whatever spaces they could find into rudimentary habitation zones capable of sustaining life in the most basic sense of the word. Both sides emerged from their shelters only to fight, donning the crude environmental suits and gas masks that would, over the centuries, become refined into the iconic uniform of the Death Corps, the gas masks. It is worth pausing here to consider the significance of those masks, because they are perhaps the most immediately recognizable element of the Death Corps aesthetic, and they carry a symbolic weight that goes far beyond their practical function. On a practical level, the gas masks were necessary. The surface of Krieg was toxic. The air was filled with radioactive particles, chemical residue, and biological contaminants left over from the destruction of the hive cities. Any soldier who ventured onto the surface without respiratory protection would be dead within hours, their lungs burned by toxic gases, their cells irradiated beyond repair. The gas mask was, quite simply, the price of doing business on the surface of a world that no longer wanted to sustain life. But over the centuries, the gas masks became something more. They became a symbol of Krieg's identity, a visual representation of the barrier that the people of Krieg had erected between themselves and the rest of humanity. Behind the mask, there are no faces. There are no individuals. There are only soldiers, interchangeable and anonymous, each one a perfect copy of the one who stood beside them. The gas mask hides the human being behind it and presents instead the image of the soldier, the weapon, the instrument of the Emperor's will. And it is a dehumanization that the people of Krieg have embraced willingly, because to them, their individual humanity is the very thing that led to the rebellion in the first place. It was human weakness, human ambition, human pride that allowed the autarch to lead Krieg astray. By hiding their faces behind masks of rubber and metal, the soldiers of Krieg are making a statement about what they have chosen to be. Not people, not individuals. Instruments, tools, weapons in the Emperor's hand, to be used and discarded as the need arises. The early years of the Civil War established the patterns that would define Krieg for centuries to come. Both sides quickly realized that large-scale maneuver warfare was impossible on a world where the surface was toxic. Visibility was measured in meters rather than kilometers, and the terrain had been reduced to a featureless expanse of craters, rubble, and irradiated mud. What emerged instead was a form of warfare that would have been grimly familiar to anyone who had studied the great trench conflicts of ancient terror. The kind of grinding, attritional, inch-by-inch fighting that consumed lives at a rate that defied comprehension and yet rarely produced decisive results. Trenches were dug, not the shallow scratchings of temporary field positions, but deep, elaborate networks of interconnected tunnels, bunkers, communication trenches, supply depots, and command posts that stretched for hundreds of kilometers across the dead surface of Krieg. The Loyalists dug from one direction, the rebels from the other, and the space between them, that narrow strip of devastated ground known in military parlance as no man's land, became the most dangerous place on the planet. To cross no man's land was to expose yourself to withering crossfire from both sides. to navigate fields of mines and booby traps, to breathe air so thick with chemical contaminants that even the best gas masks could only filter it for so long before their canisters needed replacing. And yet cross it they did, day after day, month after month, year after year, century after century. The Loyalists attacked because they believed that every inch of ground reclaimed from the rebels was an inch of Krieg restored to the Emperor's light. The rebels defended because they had nowhere else to go and nothing else to do. The fighting was brutal beyond description, a constant, grinding, mechanical process of bombardment and assault that reduced human beings to statistical inputs in an equation that neither side could solve. Shell, advance, die, replace, repeat. This was the rhythm of the war on Krieg, and it played itself out for 500 years without pause or variation. Think about that number for a moment. 500 years, 20 generations of human beings, born and raised and trained and sent to die in the trenches of a world that was already dead. Children who had never seen the sky, who had never felt wind on their faces that was not laden with toxins, who had never tasted food that was not the bland nutritional paste produced by underground protein vats. These children grew up knowing nothing but the war. It was their entire world, their entire culture, their entire reason for being. But they were conceived in underground bunkers, born in underground hospitals, trained in underground combat ranges, and sent to die on the surface of a world that had been trying to kill them since the day they arrived.
Now, I want to take a quick second here and just be real with you, because I think this is worth saying out loud. The Death Corps are hands down one of my favorite factions in all of 40k. And the reason might surprise you. It is not the aesthetic, even though the gas masks and the trench coats are undeniably cool. It is not the battlefield stats or the siege warfare specialty. What genuinely gets me every single time I dig into their lore is how sad they are. Like, there's this layer underneath everything with Krieg that just hits different once you actually sit with it. These are people who were never given the option to be anything else. They did not choose this life. Their great-great-great-grandparents did not choose it either. And yet here they are, 10,000 years later, still paying for something none of them had any part in. That concept alone keeps me up at night, honestly. It makes me think about how we carry guilt in real life, how families pass down trauma without even meaning to, how sometimes the weight of what came before us shapes who we become more than anything we actually do ourselves. That is what good lore does. It makes you feel something real even when the setting is completely fictional. But anyways, I just wanted to share that thought, and let's get back to the video.
And when they fell, their bodies left in the mud of no man's land to be absorbed back into the toxic soil, new children were already being raised to take their places. This is how a culture of death is born. Not through ideology, not through propaganda, not through the kind of top-down indoctrination that most regimes use to motivate their soldiers. It is born through environment, through the simple, undeniable reality of existing in a place where death is the most common thing that happens, where survival is the exception rather than the rule, and where the purpose of life is defined entirely by the manner of its ending. Now, the people of Krieg did not need to be told that death in service of the Emperor was the highest honor. They did not need sermons or catechisms or motivational speeches. They simply needed to look around at the world they lived in and draw the obvious conclusion. This is what we are. This is what we do. This is how it ends for all of us. And so the war ground on. The Loyalists pushed forward, took a trench line, lost it to a counterattack, pushed forward again. The rebels held, fell back, counterattacked, held again. The front lines moved back and forth across the same stretches of devastated ground, like the tide of some poisoned ocean, each advance and each retreat marked by the bodies of thousands of soldiers who had died for gains that could be measured in meters. The artillery never stopped. The gas attacks never stopped. Other mining operations, where both sides dug tunnels beneath each other's positions and packed them with explosives, never stopped. The war was a living thing, an organism made of mud and blood and steel that fed on human lives and produced nothing but more of itself. The autarch's forces, cut off from any external support and slowly losing ground to the Loyalists' relentless pressure, began to deteriorate, not just militarily, but spiritually. There are suggestions in the fragmentary records that survived the war that some rebel factions turned to darker powers in their desperation, seeking aid from sources that no loyal imperial citizen would even acknowledge. Whether this is true or simply loyalist propaganda designed to further demonize the enemy is impossible to determine at this remove. Yet what is certain is that as the centuries wore on, the rebel cause became increasingly untenable. Their population was shrinking, their resources were dwindling, their morale, never strong to begin with, was crumbling under the weight of an unwinnable war and the knowledge that the Imperium would never forget or forgive what they had done. The Loyalists, by contrast, grew stronger with each generation, not in numbers necessarily, for they suffered casualties as horrific as the rebels, but in purpose, in conviction, in the cold, hard certainty that what they were doing was right and that the Emperor's judgment, when it finally came, would fall in their favor. Each generation of Loyalist soldiers was more devout than the last, more willing to sacrifice, more indifferent to their own survival. But the culture of atonement that would come to define the death cause was being forged in real time, hammered into shape by the relentless pressure of a war that never ended and a guilt that never faded. It took 500 years. 500 years of uninterrupted warfare. 500 years of bombardment and assault and counterattack. 500 years of generation after generation marching into no man's land and not coming back. But eventually, slowly, inevitably, the Loyalists won. The last rebel strongholds fell. The last pockets of resistance were crushed. The Autarch's rebellion, which had begun with such grand ambitions of independence and self-determination, ended in the mud and the ash and the irradiated darkness of a world that had been destroyed in the process of being saved. When the Imperium finally returned to Krieg, when the first Imperial ships entered orbit around the blasted world and made contact with the survivors, what they found was not a population celebrating their liberation. What they found was a population of soldiers who had been fighting for so long that they no longer knew how to do anything else. A population that had organized itself entirely around the prosecution of war and the production of warriors. A population that spoke in military terminology, thought in military concepts, and measured the value of human life in strictly military terms. The Imperium had left behind a prosperous hive world. It returned to find a factory for soldiers, and the soldiers it produced were unlike anything the Imperial Guard had ever seen. The Administratum, in its vast and impersonal wisdom, assessed Krieg's value to the Imperium and reached a conclusion that was as pragmatic as it was chilling. Krieg's rebellion had been a stain on the planet's record, yes. But the 500-year war that followed had produced a population uniquely suited to a very specific purpose. These people were already trained for war. They were already accustomed to unimaginable hardship. They were already willing to die without question or hesitation. And they were producing soldiers at a rate that far exceeded the Imperium's normal expectations for a world of Krieg's size and resources. The Administratum did not forgive Krieg. Forgiveness is not a concept that the Imperium's bureaucracy understands or values, but it recognized utility, and the death cause of Krieg were extremely useful. The world was given a new tithe grade, and one that reflected its extraordinary military output, and the Death Corps were integrated into the broader structure of the Astra Militarum. They would be deployed wherever the Imperium had need of soldiers who could endure conditions that would break any other regiment, who could take casualties that would render any other force combat ineffective, and who would never, under any circumstances, retreat from a position they had been ordered to hold. The Death Corps had been born, and the galaxy would never be the same. To understand the soul of the Death Corps, you must understand the doctrine of guilt that permeates every aspect of Krieg's existence. Not guilt as most people understand it. Not the fleeting pang of conscience that follows a small transgression. It's the kind of guilt that fades with time and can be soothed by apology or good deeds. The guilt that drives the Death Corps is something altogether different. It is structural. It is institutional. It is woven into the very fabric of Krieg's society so deeply that it has become indistinguishable from identity itself. To be from Krieg is to be guilty. To be a Krieg soldier is to be seeking atonement. And to die in the Emperor's service is the only currency that can be offered against a debt so vast that it stretches back 500 years and encompasses the betrayal of an entire world. The mechanism by which this guilt is maintained and transmitted across generations is one of the most fascinating and disturbing aspects of Krieg's culture. On most imperial worlds, the ecclesiarchy, was the vast religious institution that manages the worship of the God Emperor across the Imperium, serves as the primary vehicle for spiritual instruction. Priests and preachers deliver sermons about duty and devotion, and the faithful respond with prayers and tithes, and the general obedience that keeps the Imperium's social machinery running. On Krieg, the ecclesiarchy still exists, but its role has been fundamentally transformed by the unique circumstances of the world's history. On Krieg, every sermon is a reminder of the rebellion. Every prayer is an acknowledgement of the sin that was committed when the autarch led the planet away from the Emperor's light. Every religious ceremony, from the naming of children to the consecration of new military units, includes specific references to the betrayal and the ongoing need for atonement. There is no moment in a Krieg citizen's life when they are allowed to forget what their ancestors did. The guilt is refreshed constantly, reinforced by ritual and repetition, until it becomes as natural and unavoidable as breathing. But it goes deeper than religious instruction. The very structure of Krieg's society is designed to suppress individuality and promote the collective over the personal. On most imperial worlds, soldiers are recruited from existing populations. They have names, families, histories, identities that existed before they became soldiers, and that, if they survive their service, will continue to exist afterward. On Krieg, the line between civilian and soldier is so blurred as to be essentially non-existent. Every citizen of Krieg is, from birth, a potential soldier. Their education is military education. Their socialization is military socialization. Their value as human beings is measured entirely by their potential contribution to the war effort. And then there is the matter of names. On most worlds in the Imperium, a soldier's name is their identity. It is carved into their dog tags, recorded in the rolls of honor, spoken by their comrades in moments of camaraderie, and by their commanders in moments of crisis. A name is the thread that connects a soldier to their past, to their family, to the person they were before the war, and the person they hope to be after it. On Krieg, names are stripped away. Soldiers of the Death Corps are identified by numerical designations, alphanumeric codes that tell you their regiment, their company, their platoon, and their position, but nothing about who they are as individuals. As a Krieg soldier is not Sergeant Hans or Corporal Maria. A Krieg soldier is designation 147 Alpha 3, or whatever combination of numbers and letters has been assigned to them by the administrative machinery of their regiment. This is not accidental. It is not a bureaucratic oversight or a practical concession to the difficulty of tracking individual soldiers in units that take such extraordinary casualties. It is deliberate. It is a choice made by Krieg's culture, reinforced by Krieg's military, and accepted by Krieg's soldiers without question or complaint. The stripping of names is the stripping of individuality, and the stripping of individuality is the stripping of the very quality that the people of Krieg believe led to the rebellion. It was individual ambition that drove the autarch, while it was individual desire that corrupted the planet's leadership. It was individual weakness that allowed the population to be led astray. By eliminating individuality, by reducing each soldier to a number and a function, Krieg ensures that the same weakness can never again take hold. You cannot betray the Emperor if you do not exist as a person capable of making that choice. The result is a military force of staggering uniformity. Look at a formation of Death Corps soldiers, and you will see rows of identical figures, gas masks concealing every face, greatcoats hanging from every frame, postures and movements so precisely drilled that they seem less like individuals standing in formation and more like a single organism with thousands of bodies. There is no variation in how they stand, how they march, how they hold their weapons. There is no personality in their gear, no individual touches or customizations of the kind that soldiers in other regiments use to express their identity. Everything is regulation. Everything is identical. Everything is designed to reinforce the message that the individual does not matter. Only the mission matters. Only the atonement matters. Only the debt matters. This uniformity extends to the way they think about death, which is to say, they think about it constantly, and they think about it with a calm acceptance that unnerves everyone who encounters it. For a Death Corps soldier, death is not a possibility to be feared or a risk to be managed. Death is the expected outcome. It is the natural and desirable conclusion to a life that was only ever meant to be a vehicle for sacrifice. When a Krieg soldier goes into battle, they do not think about coming home. There is no home to come back to, not in the sense that other soldiers understand it. There is only the trench, the next advance, the next bombardment, and eventually, if they are fortunate, the final moment when their borrowed life is returned to the Emperor and the debt is reduced by one more body. This attitude toward death manifests in ways that are deeply unsettling to those who fight alongside the Death Corps. There are countless accounts from soldiers of other regiments who have found themselves deployed next to Krieg units, and the stories they tell share a common theme of discomfort and bewilderment. Cadian veterans, hardened by decades of warfare against the most terrifying enemies the galaxy can produce, have reported feeling genuinely disturbed by the behavior of Krieg soldiers. Not because the Krieg soldiers were cruel or unstable or dangerous to those around them, but because they seemed so completely unconcerned about their own deaths that it called into question the very framework of values that most soldiers use to make sense of their lives. One account, preserved in the archives of the Departamento Munitorum, describes a joint operation between a Cadian regiment and a Death Corps infantry company during a campaign against an Orc stronghold on a world whose name has been lost to the bureaucratic chaos of the Imperium's record-keeping. The Cadian commander, a colonel with 30 years of combat experience, requested a meeting with his Krieg counterpart to coordinate the assault. What he found when he entered the Krieg command bunker was a scene that he later described as the most unsettling experience of his entire military career. The Krieg officers were gathered around a tactical map, planning the assault with meticulous precision. Every detail had been accounted for, every contingency planned for, every possible outcome mapped and measured. But what struck the Cadian colonel was the casualty projections. The Krieg plan called for a frontal assault against the Orc positions, supported by artillery and preceded by a forlorn hope, a deliberately suicidal advance party designed to draw the enemy's fire and reveal their positions. The projected casualty rate for the operation was 70%. 7 out of every 10 soldiers in the assault force were expected to die. The Cadian colonel, accustomed to planning operations with casualty projections in the single digits, and considering anything above 20% to be a sign that the plan needed revision, objected. He proposed an alternative approach, a flanking maneuver that would reduce the expected casualties significantly while achieving the same objective. The Krieg commander listened politely, considered the proposal, and rejected it. Not because the flanking maneuver was tactically unsound, but because it was unnecessary. The frontal assault would achieve the objective. The casualties, while high, were within acceptable parameters. The soldiers who would die had been born for this purpose. Their deaths would be meaningful. What more could be asked? The Cadian colonel left the meeting and reportedly spent the rest of the evening sitting in his tent, staring at the wall, trying to process what he had just witnessed. These were not madmen. They were not zealots frothing at the mouth with the kind of fanatical fervor that sometimes overtook poorly disciplined imperial forces. They were calm, rational, methodical soldiers who had simply arrived at a different set of conclusions about the value of human life than the rest of the Imperium. And those conclusions were not wrong exactly. They were simply operating from a different set of assumptions. If your starting point is that every soldier's life is already forfeit, that death in service is the only meaningful outcome, then casualty projections are not a constraint to be minimized. They are a resource to be allocated. This is the terrifying efficiency of the death cause. They do not waste lives in the way that careless or incompetent commanders waste lives. Every death is calculated. Every sacrifice is planned. The Krieg officers who send their soldiers into situations where survival is unlikely are not being callous. They are being precise. They know exactly what they are spending and exactly what they expect to purchase with that expenditure. A trench line, a hill, a few hundred meters of ground, an artillery position silenced, a bunker taken. Each objective has a price measured in bodies, and the death cause pay that price without flinching because they believe, with absolute sincerity, that the price is fair. But there is another dimension to the death cause relationship with death that is often overlooked in discussions of their fanaticism, and it is perhaps the most tragic aspect of their entire existence. The death cause do not merely accept death, they desire it, not in the self-destructive way of someone who has given up on life, but in the redemptive way of someone who believes that death is the only path to forgiveness. A Krieg soldier who survives a battle has not been granted a reprieve. They have been denied the opportunity to atone. Survival is not a victory for a Krieg soldier. It is a delay. It is one more day of carrying the weight of a sin that only death can pay for. This desire for meaningful death creates a paradox that defines the death cause existence. They are phenomenal soldiers, precisely because they do not care whether they live or die, which makes them extraordinarily difficult to break in combat. But they are also profoundly damaged human beings, trapped in a cycle of guilt and atonement that offers no exit except the one they constantly seek. They cannot be healed because they do not believe they are sick. They cannot be freed from their guilt because they do not believe they deserve freedom. They exist in a state of perpetual spiritual suffering, relieved only by the temporary purpose that combat provides and the permanent release that death promises. And so the death cause march on, generation after generation, wearing the masks of the dead and carrying the guilt of ancestors they never knew. They march out of the underground complexes of their ravaged homeworld, board the transports that will carry them to whatever war zone the Imperium has deemed worthy of their particular brand of devotion, and they fight with the quiet, implacable, mechanical determination that has made them legend. They fight not for glory, they fight not for survival, they fight not for any of the things that motivate other soldiers in other armies on other worlds. They fight to die, and in dying, they hope to find the peace that 500 years of warfare could not provide. The relationship between the death cause and the imperial cult, the vast religious apparatus that manages the worship of the god emperor across the Imperium, is complex and often contradictory. On one hand, the death cause are among the most devout servants of the emperor in the entire Astra Militarum. Their willingness to sacrifice everything, including their lives, their identities, and their very humanity, in the emperor's name, is unmatched by any other regiment. The ecclesiarchy holds them up as examples of what true devotion looks like, pointing to their selfless service and their absolute obedience as proof of what faith can achieve. On the other hand, there is something about the death cause brand of devotion that makes even the most hardened members of the ecclesiarchy uncomfortable. Because the death cause faith is not really faith at all, not in the way that most imperial citizens understand it. It is not the warm, sustaining belief that the emperor protects his faithful and that loyal service will be rewarded in the afterlife. It is a cold, transactional understanding that the emperor demands a price and that price must be paid in blood. There is no comfort in the death cause relationship with the emperor. There is no love, there is only obligation, and the grim determination to fulfill it no matter what. This transactional faith manifests in ways that are profoundly unsettling to those who expect religion to provide comfort and meaning. Death Corps soldiers do not pray for protection before battle. They pray for the opportunity to serve. They do not ask the emperor to spare them from harm. They ask the emperor to accept their sacrifice as worthy. Their hymns are not songs of hope or triumph. They are dirges, slow and heavy, and filled with the weight of centuries of accumulated guilt. When a death corps regiment musters for battle, the sound of their collective prayer is not the uplifting chorus that the ecclesiarchy teaches on other worlds. It is a low, rhythmic chant that sounds more like a funeral rite than a battle hymn, and perhaps that is exactly what it is. Well, it's because for the Death Corps, every battle is a funeral, every advance is a procession toward the grave. Every soldier who marches into no man's land is walking their own last mile, and they know it, and they welcome it, and they would not have it any other way. The psychological cost of this worldview is difficult to overstate. Human beings are not naturally designed to welcome death. Evolution has spent millions of years equipping us with survival instincts, with fear responses, with the desperate, clinging desire to continue living that makes us duck when something flies at our heads and flinch when we touch something hot. To overcome these instincts requires either extreme circumstances or extreme conditioning, and on Krieg, both are present in abundance. The extreme circumstances are the toxic, irradiated, a hostile environment in which every Krieg citizen lives. The extreme conditioning is the relentless, cradle-to-grave program of indoctrination that teaches every Krieg child that their life has value only insofar as it can be spent in the Emperor's service. The combination produces soldiers who are, in a very real sense, broken. Not broken in the way that shell-shocked veterans are broken, with trembling hands and haunted eyes and the inability to sleep without reliving the horrors they have witnessed. Broken in a deeper, more fundamental way. Broken in their very understanding of what it means to be alive. A Death Corps soldier functions perfectly within the narrow parameters of military service. They follow orders, they maintain their equipment, they perform their duties with mechanical precision. But outside of those parameters, they are empty. They do not joke, they do not socialize, they do not form friendships or romantic attachments or any of the other human connections that make life worth living for the rest of humanity. They exist in a state of functional emptiness, present in the world but not truly participating in it, waiting for the moment when they will be called upon to serve and, ultimately, to die. There are accounts of non-Krieg soldiers attempting to connect with Death Corps personnel on a human level, to make conversation, to share a meal, to engage in the kind of casual interaction that bonds soldiers together and makes the hardships of military life bearable. These accounts almost universally end in failure, not because the Krieg soldiers are hostile or unfriendly, but because they simply do not understand the purpose of such interactions. Or why would you share a meal with someone when both of you are going to be dead by this time next week? Why would you learn someone's name when names are irrelevant and only designations matter? Why would you invest emotional energy in a connection that serves no tactical purpose and will only make it harder to do what needs to be done when the time comes? This is the true cost of Krieg's fanaticism, not the bodies that pile up in the trenches or the worlds that are bought with Death Corps blood. The true cost is the humanity that has been systematically stripped from millions of human beings over the course of millennia, leaving behind soldiers who are perfect in their function, but hollow in their essence. But the Death Corps are the Imperium's most fanatical soldiers because they have sacrificed everything that makes fanaticism a human quality. They are devoted beyond measure, but their devotion is a void rather than a fire. It consumes rather than creates. It destroys rather than sustains. And yet, in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, perhaps that is exactly what is needed. Perhaps the galaxy is so hostile, so unforgiving, so utterly indifferent to human suffering, that the only appropriate response is to become equally indifferent. Perhaps the Death Corps are not broken at all, but rather perfectly adapted to an existence that would break anyone who tried to face it with their humanity intact. That is the question that the Death Corps pose to everyone who encounters them. and it is a question that has no comfortable answer. Now let us speak of how these soldiers are made, because the death corps of Krieg do not simply recruit their soldiers from the general population the way most Imperial Guard regiments do. They do not hold conscription lotteries or offer enlistment bonuses or rely on the natural flow of young men and women who, for whatever reason, choose military service over the alternatives. On Krieg, there are no alternatives. Every citizen is a soldier in waiting, and the machinery that transforms them from helpless infants into the galaxy's most expendable warriors is a process of such cold efficiency that it makes even the Adeptus Astartes recruitment programs look gentle by comparison. It begins with the Vitae womb. This is one of the most controversial aspects of Krieg's military-industrial complex, and it is one that the Imperium has been content to overlook because the results it produces are too valuable to question. The Vitae womb is, in essence, an artificial birthing technology that allows Krieg to produce new soldiers at a rate far exceeding what natural reproduction would allow. The exact details of the technology are shrouded in the kind of secrecy that the Mechanicus reserves for its most sensitive procedures, but the broad strokes are known. Genetic material is collected, embryos are cultivated in artificial environments, and the resulting children are decanted into the care of the military establishment that will raise them from their first breath to their last. The ethical implications of this system are, always within the context of the Imperium, essentially irrelevant. The Imperium does not concern itself with the ethics of how soldiers are produced. It concerns itself only with whether the soldiers produced are effective. And the soldiers that Krieg produces through the Vitae Womb program are extraordinarily effective. They are genetically consistent, which reduces the variability that natural reproduction introduces and makes it easier to standardize training and equipment. They are available in quantities that a world of Krieg's diminished population could never produce through natural means. And they enter the training pipeline without the family attachments, personal histories, and individual identities that might otherwise complicate the process of turning them into the interchangeable instruments of war that the death course requires. Not all of Krieg's soldiers come from the Vitae womb, however. Natural reproduction still occurs in the underground habitation zones of Krieg's hive complexes, and the children born through natural means are subjected to the same training regimen as their artificially produced counterparts. In this way, Krieg maintains a population that is partially natural and partially engineered, with no distinction made between the two. A soldier is a soldier, regardless of how they were created. Only their designation matters. Only their function matters. Only their willingness to die matters. Training begins early. On most Imperial worlds, children are allowed some semblance of a childhood before they are inducted into military service. They play games. They attend schooling that includes subjects beyond combat and doctrine. They form friendships and family bonds that give them a foundation of human experience, upon which their military identity will eventually be built. On Krieg, there is no such foundation. Training begins as soon as a child is physically capable of holding a weapon and cognitively capable of understanding simple orders. The curriculum is entirely military: physical conditioning, weapons handling, tactical doctrine, siege engineering, chemical warfare protocols, environmental survival in the toxic surface conditions that make Krieg the hellscape it is. The training takes place in conditions that are designed to replicate the worst possible combat environments. Krieg's surface, still toxic and irradiated after 10 millennia, serves as a natural training ground of unparalleled harshness. Recruits are sent onto the surface in their gas masks and environmental suits, forced to navigate crater fields and trench systems while live ammunition whips overhead and chemical shells burst around them. The casualties during training are not insignificant. The Death Corps considers training deaths to be a natural and acceptable part of the filtration process, weeding out those who lack the physical or psychological resilience to survive the realities of combat. Those who die in training have fulfilled their purpose earlier than expected. That is all. The survivors emerge from this process as some of the most thoroughly conditioned soldiers in the Imperium. They can dig a trench system with the speed and precision of a combat engineering unit. They can maintain and repair their personal weapons under any conditions. But they can operate effectively in environments that would incapacitate soldiers from other regiments. Toxic atmospheres, irradiated zones, areas contaminated by chemical or biological agents. They are expert marksmen, not because the Death Corps favors marksmanship over volume of fire, but because ammunition is a resource to be spent efficiently, just like lives. And they can march. They can march for hours, for days, carrying full combat loads through terrain that would exhaust fresh soldiers in minutes. And they do it without complaint, because complaint is a concept that has no place in the vocabulary of a Krieg soldier. The equipment of the Death Corps reflects their doctrine of attrition warfare and siege operations. Let us begin with the most iconic element, the gas mask and the greatcoat. The gas mask, as we have discussed, originated as a practical necessity on the toxic surface of Krieg and evolved into a symbol of the regiment's identity. The standard issue Krieg gas mask is a robust, functional design that provides filtration against a wide range of chemical, biological, and radiological threats. It covers the entire face, leaving no skin exposed, and it incorporates the Vox caster that allows communication between soldiers. The lenses are typically dark, almost opaque from the outside, which means that anyone looking at a Krieg soldier sees not a face, but a blank, expressionless mask. 2 dark circles where eyes should be, and a cylindrical filter where a mouth should be. It is a deliberately dehumanizing image, and it is effective. The greatcoat is equally practical and equally symbolic. It is a heavy garment, designed to provide protection against the elements, and some measure of defense against shrapnel and debris. In the trenches, where soldiers spend hours or days in wet, muddy, cold conditions, the greatcoat provides essential warmth and weatherproofing. But like the gas mask, it serves a secondary purpose. It conceals the body beneath it, making it difficult to distinguish one soldier from another. Combined with the gas mask, the standard issue helmet, and the regulation equipment harness, the greatcoat completes the transformation of an individual human being into a standardized military unit. A Death Corps soldier in full kit is indistinguishable from every other Death Corps soldier in full kit. That is the point. The standard weapons of the Death Corps infantryman include the Lucius pattern lasgun, a variant of the standard Imperial lasgun that is favored by Krieg for its reliability and ease of maintenance. The Lucius pattern is not the most powerful lasgun variant available. It does not have the rapid-fire capability of some models or the range of others. But it is sturdy, it functions reliably in the most adverse conditions, and it can be manufactured in the enormous quantities that the Death Corps' attritional style of warfare demands. A Krieg soldier treats their lasgun with the same meticulous care that they apply to every piece of equipment they are issued, cleaning and maintaining it with religious devotion because a malfunctioning weapon is a waste of resources. And waste is a sin on Krieg, second only to the original betrayal itself. In addition to their lasguns, Death Corps soldiers carry entrenching tools, not just for the practical purpose of digging, but as improvised close combat weapons. The standard Krieg entrenching tool is a brutal implement, its blade sharpened to a razor edge, designed to be used in the close quarters fighting that inevitably occurs when trench lines are overrun. Krieg soldiers are trained in its use as a weapon with the same thoroughness that they are trained in marksmanship, and in the claustrophobic confines of a trench assault, the entrenching tool can be more effective than a bayonet. But the Death Corps' most distinctive combat element, and one that deserves special attention for its sheer audacity in a galaxy of armored vehicles and orbital weapons platforms, is the Death Rider cavalry. Yes, cavalry. Mounted soldiers on horseback, charging across no man's land, with explosive-tipped lances, lowered, and the rumble of hooves shaking the ground beneath them. In an era of tanks and aircraft and weapons capable of destroying entire planets, the Death Corps maintain mounted cavalry units that would not look entirely out of place on the battlefields of ancient terror. The Death Riders are mounted on specially bred horses that have been adapted over centuries to survive in the toxic conditions of Krieg's surface. These animals are tough, resilient, and remarkably resistant to the chemical and radiological hazards that would kill an unprotected horse in minutes. They wear gas masks of their own, modified versions of the standard Krieg pattern that protect their respiratory systems from the toxic atmosphere. The sight of Death Rider cavalry thundering across a battlefield, when their horses draped in protective equipment and their riders carrying explosive hunting lances designed to penetrate enemy armor on the charge, is one of the most arresting images in the entire Warhammer 40,000 universe. The hunting lance itself is a remarkable weapon. It is a long, heavy shaft tipped with an explosive charge that detonates on impact, allowing the mounted rider to punch through armored vehicles and fortified positions with the momentum of a full cavalry charge. Each lance is single use. Once it has been planted in an enemy and the charge has detonated, the lance is destroyed. This means that each Death Rider gets one charge, one moment of devastating impact, before they must switch to secondary weapons like their laser guns or sabers. The single-use nature of the lance carries obvious symbolic weight. One charge, one chance. As one sacrifice. It is the Death Corps ethos distilled into a single weapon. The Death Riders serve as the shock element of the Death Corps' otherwise grinding, attritional approach to warfare, where the infantry advances methodically through the trench systems, trading ground for time and lives for objectives. The Death Riders provide the sudden, violent impact that can break enemy formations and exploit gaps in defensive lines. They charge into the teeth of enemy fire with the same indifference to casualties that characterizes all Death Corps operations. And the sight of a line of gas-masked riders galloping towards you with explosive lances lowered is the kind of psychological shock that can break morale even among hardened troops. Beyond the infantry and the cavalry, the Death Corps field extensive artillery batteries that form the backbone of their siege warfare doctrine. The Death Corps love artillery in the same way that fish love water. It is their natural element, the weapon system around which their entire approach to warfare is built. Heavy guns, siege mortars, earthshaker cannons. These are the tools with which the Death Corps reduce enemy positions to rubble before the infantry advances to claim what remains. A Death Corps siege begins with a bombardment that can last for days, weeks, or even months. The guns firing with mechanical regularity, each shell contributing to the slow, systematic destruction of the enemy's defenses. The artillery crews of the Death Corps are among the most skilled in the Imperium. They have been trained in the mathematics of ballistic trajectories since childhood, and they can lay down fire with a precision that would impress even the Adeptus Astartes. Their guns are maintained with the same obsessive care that characterizes every aspect of Death Corps equipment management, and the supply lines that keep those guns fed with ammunition are planned and maintained with a logistical precision that reflects centuries of experience in the kind of sustained, attritional warfare where running out of shells is the difference between victory and defeat. The Death Corps also field specialized siege units, engineers equipped with the tools and training necessary to dig approach trenches, construct field fortifications, lay minefields, clear obstacles, and perform the 1,000 other tasks that make siege warfare possible. These engineers are not the glamorous figures that dominate Imperial propaganda, yet they are the workhorses of the Death Corps' war machine, the soldiers who dig the trenches that the infantry will fight from, who lay the communication lines that keep the army connected, who build the bunkers that protect the command staff, and who, when the time comes, dig the tunnels beneath enemy positions and pack them with the explosives that will bring those positions crashing down. The Grenadiers represent the elite of the Death Corps infantry, soldiers selected for additional training and equipped with superior gear. Where the standard Death Corps infantryman carries a lasgun and an entrenching tool, the Grenadier carries a hellgun, the more powerful variant of the lasgun that draws additional energy from a backpack-mounted power source. They wear heavier armor, carry more grenades, and are typically assigned the most dangerous missions: the assaults on fortified positions, the clearance of enemy bunkers, the vanguard actions that require soldiers capable of fighting through the most intense resistance. Being selected as a grenadier is not considered an honor on Krieg in the way that it might be on other worlds. It is simply an assignment, a recognition that a particular soldier has the skills and resilience to perform a more demanding role. The grenadiers accept their assignment with the same flat indifference that characterizes all Death Corps' responses to orders. They do not celebrate. They do not feel pride. They simply equip themselves with their new gear, familiarize themselves with their new weapons, and prepare to fulfill their designated function with the same mechanical efficiency that they applied to their previous role. The tactical doctrine of the Death Corps is centered on one primary capability, siege warfare, and everything in their organization, their equipment, their training, and their culture is optimized for this single purpose. When the Death Corps are deployed to a war zone, they bring with them everything they need to conduct extended siege operations. They bring the artillery to bombard enemy positions into submission. They bring the engineers to dig the approach trenches that will carry the infantry forward. They bring the infantry to assault and hold the objectives that the artillery has prepared. And they bring the willingness to accept casualties at rates that would render any other regiment combat ineffective within days. A Death Corps siege is a thing of terrible beauty, if beauty is the right word for such systematic destruction. It begins with reconnaissance, as scouts and forward observers map the enemy's positions and identify targets for the artillery. Then comes the bombardment, which can last for weeks as the guns systematically destroy the enemy's fortifications, supply lines, and communication networks. Then come the approach trenches, dug by engineering teams working around the clock, extending forward across no man's land under the cover of the bombardment. Then come the assault trenches, positioned just outside the effective range of the enemy's remaining defenses. And then comes the assault itself, waves of infantry rising from their trenches and advancing into the smoke and fire with the silent, relentless determination that has become the Death Corps' signature. The casualties in these assaults are always high. They are expected to be high. The plans account for them. The reserve forces are organized to replace them. The supply lines are calibrated to sustain them. And the soldiers who fall are not mourned, because mourning implies a sense of loss. And the Death Corps do not consider death in battle to be a loss. It is a fulfillment. It is the completion of the purpose for which each soldier was created. This is the machinery of the Death Corps. This is how they are made, how they are equipped, how they are trained, and how they fight. It is a machinery of extraordinary efficiency and extraordinary cruelty, designed to produce the perfect expendable soldier and to deploy that soldier in the kind of grinding, attritional warfare that consumes lives like fuel. And it works. By every metric that the Imperium uses to measure military effectiveness, the Death Corps of Krieg are among the most successful regiments in the Astra Militarum. They achieve their objectives. They hold their positions. They win their wars. The cost of that success is measured not in currency or resources, but in the countless human lives that are spent with the same casual efficiency that a normal army spends ammunition. And the soldiers who pay that cost accept it without question, because to question it would be to question the very foundation of their existence. They are the Death Corps of Krieg. They were born to die. Everything else is just preparation. Of all the campaigns fought by the Death Corps of Krieg across the millennia, none captures their essence more completely than the Siege of Vrax. This was not the largest battle they ever fought, nor the most strategically significant in the grand calculus of the Imperium's endless wars. But it was the campaign that demonstrated, with terrible clarity, exactly what the Death Corps were and exactly what they were willing to endure in the pursuit of their objectives. The Siege of Vrax is, in many ways, the Death Corps' defining moment, the battle that crystallized their reputation and cemented their place in the dark mythology of the 41st Millennium. Vrax Prime was a world of the Imperium, an armory world belonging to the Departamento Munitorum, as one of the vast administrative bodies responsible for supplying the Imperium's military forces. Think of it as a warehouse, but on a planetary scale. Vrax Prime existed for a single purpose: to store the weapons, ammunition, vehicles, and supplies needed to keep the Imperium's armies fighting. Its surface was covered with enormous storage complexes, each one containing enough material to equip entire armies. Its population consisted primarily of laborers, administrators, and the garrison forces tasked with protecting the planet's priceless contents. It was not a glamorous world. It was not a beautiful world. It was a cog in the machine, a supply depot dressed up as a planet, and for most of its history, it functioned exactly as intended. That changed when the planet's cardinal, a man named Zafan, went mad, or was corrupted, or simply decided that the power he wielded as Vrax's spiritual leader was not enough, and that more could be obtained by reaching beyond the Emperor's light toward darker sources of authority. The specifics of Zafan's fall are debated by Imperial scholars, but the result was unambiguous. The Cardinal declared Vrax independent from the Imperium, rallied the planet's population to his banner through a combination of fiery rhetoric and manufactured miracles, and began fortifying the world against the Imperial response that he knew would eventually come. Zafan's rebellion was not a small affair. The population of Vrax, whipped into a frenzy of misguided devotion, threw themselves into the construction of defensive works with the enthusiasm of true believers. The planet's surface was transformed into a fortress of staggering proportions, with concentric rings of defenses radiating outward from the central citadel where Zafan had established his seat of power. Trench lines, bunker complexes, minefields, anti-aircraft positions, artillery emplacements, all of it built with the resources of a world that had been stockpiling military material for centuries. Whatever else Zafan was, he was not stupid. He understood that the Imperium would come for him, and he intended to make them pay dearly for every inch of ground. The Imperium's response came in the form of the 88th Siege Army, and the backbone of that force was composed of death corps of Krieg regiments. The choice was deliberate. Vrax's concentric ring of defenses demanded a siege approach, a slow, methodical reduction of the planet's fortifications through sustained bombardment and attritional ground warfare. But this was exactly the kind of fighting that the Death Corps had been designed for. It was the kind of fighting they had been bred for, trained for, and psychologically conditioned to excel at. The parallels with their homeworld's own history were impossible to ignore. Once again, a world had turned away from the Emperor. Once again, loyalist forces would be tasked with bringing it back into compliance. And once again, the price would be measured in the currency that the Death Corps knew best: bodies. The siege began with the standard Death Corps approach: artillery bombardment, sustained and methodical, designed to soften the outer ring of defenses and suppress the enemy's ability to respond. Engineering teams began digging approach trenches, extending the loyalist positions forward toward the first line of Vrax defenses with the painstaking precision that characterized all Death Corps operations. Supply lines were established, communication networks laid, medical stations prepared for the casualties that everyone knew were coming. The first assaults were costly, as first assaults always were in Death Corps operations. The outer ring of defenses was held by Vrax's militia, a mix of true believers, conscripted laborers, and the remnants of the planet's original garrison forces. They fought with the desperation of people who had been told that the Imperium would show no mercy to those who had turned against it, which, to be fair, was entirely accurate. The fighting was brutal, close quarters, and characterized by the grinding, inch-by-inch progress that defined Death Corps siege warfare. Trenches were dug, assaulted, lost, retaken, lost again, and retaken again. The dead piled up in the communication trenches and had to be moved to make room for the living. The wounded were evacuated to field hospitals, where overworked medical personnel did their best with limited resources, though the Death Corps' own medics spent less time on pain management and comfort care than their counterparts in other regiments. A Krieg soldier who was wounded badly enough to be removed from combat, but not badly enough to die, was a problem, a resource that had been partially expended but could not be fully utilized. The most severely wounded were often returned to the front lines as soon as they were physically capable of holding a weapon, regardless of whether they had fully recovered, kept the siege ground on for months, then years. The first ring of defenses fell, eventually, under the sustained pressure of artillery bombardment and infantry assault. The Death Corps advanced to the second ring and began the process again. Dig, bombard, assault, take casualties, replace casualties. Dig, bombard, assault. The rhythm was mechanical, repetitive, and utterly relentless. The defenders of Vrax, who had expected a quick campaign and an even quicker resolution, found themselves trapped in a war of attrition against an opponent who seemed genuinely indifferent to the passage of time and the accumulation of casualties. It was during the middle years of the siege that the nature of the enemy began to change. Zaphan's rebellion, which had begun as a schismatic movement within the imperial cult, and increasingly showed signs of chaos corruption. The defenders began to exhibit mutations and aberrant behavior consistent with exposure to warp energies. Symbols of the ruinous powers appeared on their fortifications. Demonic entities were reported in the deeper sections of the defensive network. The war was no longer simply a matter of reclaiming a rebel world for the Imperium. It had become a struggle against the forces of chaos itself. For most regiments, this development would have been a cause for serious concern. The forces of chaos are not like other enemies. They do not simply fight with weapons and tactics. They fight with corruption, with temptation, with the insidious whisper of dark gods who promise power and pleasure and freedom from the constraints of mortal existence. Soldiers who face chaos for extended periods are at risk of contamination, their faith eroded by constant exposure to energies that warp the mind and corrupt the soul. The Death Corps were largely immune to this particular threat, and the reason why tells you everything you need to know about the nature of their fanaticism. The Death Corps could not be tempted by chaos, because chaos had nothing to offer them. The dark gods promise power to the ambitious, pleasure to the desiring, freedom to the constrained. The Death Corps had no ambition beyond fulfilling their duty. They had no desires beyond the desire for meaningful death. They had no sense of being constrained because they had never known freedom and had never been taught to value it. The whispers of chaos fell on deaf ears, not because the Death Corps were protected by superior faith, but because they had been so thoroughly stripped of the human qualities that chaos typically exploits that there was nothing for the corruption to take hold of. This immunity had a practical benefit during the siege of Vrax that was difficult to overstate. While other imperial forces, including elements of the Adeptus Astartes that were deployed to assist in the later stages of the campaign, had to rotate their troops regularly to prevent the psychological damage that prolonged chaos exposure causes, the Death Corps could remain in the line indefinitely. They dug their trenches within sight of demonic incursions and did not flinch. They advanced through areas saturated with warp energy and did not waver. And they killed corrupted defenders whose bodies had been twisted by chaos into forms that would haunt the nightmares of normal soldiers. And they did it with the same mechanical efficiency that they applied to every other tactical problem. The siege of Vrax lasted for 17 years. 17 years of continuous siege warfare. 17 years of bombardment and assault and counterattack. 17 years of casualty rates that would have reduced most armies to broken remnants within the first 18 months. The Death Corps suffered staggering losses throughout the campaign. Entire regiments were wiped out and replaced by fresh formations from Krieg. The total number of Death Corps casualties over the course of the siege is estimated in the millions. As a figure so large that it ceases to have meaning in any human terms and becomes simply a number in a ledger, another entry in the vast accounting of Krieg's ongoing debt. And yet they won. Ring by ring, fortification by fortification, bunker by bunker, the Death Corps ground their way through the defenses of Vrax until they reached the central citadel where Zafan had made his final stand. The Cardinal's forces, by this point thoroughly corrupted by chaos, fought with the feral desperation of the damned, but desperation alone could not overcome the methodical, relentless pressure that the Death Corps brought to bear. The citadel fell. Zafan was killed, or banished, or consumed by the very powers he had bargained with, depending on which account you trust. And Vrax Prime was reclaimed for the Imperium, its population purged, and its resources recovered, its surface scarred by 17 years of the most intense siege warfare the sector had seen in millennia. The aftermath of the siege of Vrax was revealing. When the final tallies were compiled and the casualty reports filed, the sheer scale of the Death Corps' sacrifice became clear. Millions of soldiers had died. Dozens of regiments had been completely destroyed. The financial cost, measured in the resources required to supply and reinforce the siege for 17 years, was astronomical. By any rational calculation, the cost of retaking Vrax had far exceeded the value of the planet itself. The weapons and supplies stored there could have been replaced for a fraction of what the siege had cost in lives and material. But the Death Corps had not fought for rational calculations. But they had fought because they had been ordered to, and because the act of fighting, the act of suffering, the act of dying was its own justification. Every soldier who fell on Vrax had reduced Krieg's debt by one more life. Every regiment that was destroyed had contributed to the ongoing atonement that gave Krieg's existence meaning. The strategic value of Vrax was almost irrelevant to the Death Corps. What mattered was the opportunity to serve, to sacrifice, and to die. The siege of Vrax became the standard by which all subsequent Death Corps operations were measured, not because it was their greatest victory, but because it was their most complete expression. Everything that the Death Corps were, everything they believed, everything they were willing to endure, was on display during those 17 years of grinding, attritional, spectacularly bloody warfare. Other regiments could point to battles won through clever maneuvers, or daring charges, or individual heroism. The Death Corps pointed to Vrax and said simply, "This is who we are. This is what we do. And this is what we are willing to pay." Beyond Vrax, the Death Corps have fought in campaigns across the breadth of the Imperium, their reputation preceding them to every war zone and their methods remaining consistent, regardless of the enemy or the terrain. During engagements against Orc hordes, where other regiments might rely on speed and maneuver to counter the Greenskins' brutal charge tactics, the Death Corps simply dig in and let the enemy break against their defenses, like waves against a cliff face. Their trenches absorb the impact of the assault, while their artillery devastates the massed formations that the Greenskins favor, and their infantry holds the line with the same immovable determination that has defined every Death Corps defensive action since the Civil War. The Orcs, for their part, find the Death Corps confusing. The Greenskins fight for the joy of combat, for the thrill of violence, for the sheer exhilaration of smashing things and being smashed in return. They expect their enemies to fight with similar passion, to rage and charge and engage in the kind of frantic, chaotic melee that the Greenskins consider to be the highest form of entertainment. The Death Corps deny them this satisfaction completely. There is no passion in a Death Corps defense. There is no rage, no fear, no excitement. There is only the methodical, mechanical process of killing, carried out with the same emotional investment that a factory machine applies to stamping out parts. The Orcs attack. The Death Corps fire. The Orcs fall. More Orcs attack. The Death Corps fire again. The cycle repeats until the Orc assault is exhausted or the Death Corps position is overrun. And even if the position is overrun, the surviving Death Corps soldiers do not flee. They fight to the last, in the trenches, in the bunkers, hand to hand with entrenching tools and bayonets, because retreat is a concept that has no place in the Death Corps vocabulary. Against the Eldar, the ancient and enigmatic alien race, whose speed and cunning have humbled countless Imperial commanders, the Death Corps' attritional approach is less effective, but no less committed. The Elder fight wars of maneuver is striking quickly at vulnerable points and withdrawing before the enemy can respond. This style of warfare is antithetical to the Death Corps' methodical siege approach, and Elder commanders who face Death Corps regiments typically find themselves fighting a different kind of battle than they expected. The Death Corps cannot match the Elder's speed or agility, but they can absorb punishment that would shatter other formations, and they can continue to function long after the Elder's hit-and-run tactics have stopped producing meaningful results. It becomes a war of endurance rather than maneuver, and endurance is the one thing the Death Corps have in unlimited supply. Against Tyranid swarms, the Death Corps face an enemy that shares their indifference to individual casualties but surpasses them in sheer numbers. Yet the bioengineered horrors of the hive fleets do not feel fear, do not waver, do not hesitate. They advance in waves that can number in the millions, consuming everything in their path and replenishing their losses with biomass harvested from the very ground they fight on. Fighting Tyranids is the closest thing the Death Corps have to fighting a mirror image of themselves, an enemy that views its soldiers as expendable and its strategy as one of simple, relentless attrition. The Death Corps' response to Tyranid incursions is characteristically straightforward. Dig in, fortify, layer the killing ground with mines, barbed wire, and pre-registered artillery targets, and then hold. Hold as the chitinous tide washes over the defenses. Hold as the smaller bioorganisms probe for weaknesses and the larger ones smash against the fortifications. Or hold as the casualties mount and the ammunition runs low and the trenches fill with the corpses of both sides. Hold until relief arrives, or until the swarm moves on, or until the last soldier falls and the position is overrun. The Death Corps have fought actions against Tyranid splinter fleets, where entire regiments were consumed to the last soldier, their positions overrun after days of continuous fighting, the defenders firing their weapons until the barrels melted and then fighting with their hands until there was nothing left to fight with. These actions are not considered defeats by the Death Corps. They are considered successful, delaying actions. The regiment that was destroyed bought time for other Imperial forces to regroup, to fortify, to prepare their own defenses. The soldiers who died fulfilled their purpose. Their lives were spent in the most useful way possible. What more could be asked? Against chaos, the Death Corps' eternal adversary, the enemy that represents everything that Krieg has sworn to oppose, the fighting takes on a dimension that goes beyond mere tactical necessity. When the Death Corps face the forces of chaos, they are not simply fighting an enemy. They are fighting the embodiment of the sin that created them. Chaos is what the Autarch invited into their world. Chaos is what corrupted their ancestors and led to the betrayal that Krieg has spent 10,000 years trying to atone for. Every Chaos Marine killed, every demon banished, every corruption cleansed, is another payment against the debt, another step toward the redemption that the Death Corps will never stop pursuing. The Death Corps fight chaos with a ferocity that exceeds even their normal level of commitment, which is saying something. They advance into warp-corrupted zones without hesitation. They engage demonic entities with the same clinical efficiency that they apply to all other targets. They purge chaos cultists with flamer and grenade, cleansing their positions with fire and steel, and the methodical thoroughness that characterizes all Death Corps operations. And when the battle is over, when the chaos forces have been driven back and the corruption cleansed, the Death Corps do not celebrate. They simply prepare for the next engagement, the next opportunity to serve, the next chance to reduce the debt that can never truly be paid. There are other campaigns worthy of mention, as other battles where the Death Corps demonstrated their unique qualities. Engagements on fortress worlds and hive cities and frontier outposts across the length and breadth of the Imperium, each one adding another chapter to the long, bloody, magnificent, terrible story of the Death Corps of Krieg. But the pattern is always the same. Deploy, dig in, bombard, assault, take casualties, replace casualties, repeat until the objective is achieved or the regiment is destroyed. The method is brutal, the cost is staggering, and the results are undeniable. The death corps win their wars. They win them slowly, painfully, at costs that would appall the commanders of any other military force in history. But they win, and they keep winning, generation after generation, century after century, because the alternative is to stop fighting. And to stop fighting is to stop atoning, and to stop atoning is to accept the stain of their ancestors' betrayal as permanent and unforgivable. And that, more than anything else, is something the death corps of Krieg will never do. Every regiment of the Astra Militarum is assigned a commissar. This is one of the fundamental organizational principles of the Imperial Guard, a system as old as the Imperium itself, and designed to address what the Imperium's founders correctly identified as the weakest link in any military chain: the human will. Commissars are political officers, attached to military units, not to command them, but to ensure that they fight. Their authority is absolute in matters of discipline and morale. They carry bolt pistols, and they are authorized to use them on any soldier who shows signs of cowardice, insubordination, or any other failure of duty that might compromise the unit's effectiveness. The commissar is the Imperium's answer to the question of what happens when a soldier's survival instinct overrides their sense of duty. The answer, delivered with the sharp crack of a bolt round to the back of the head, is unambiguous. In most regiments, the commissar's role is one of motivation through fear. Soldiers fight because they are more afraid of the commissar behind them than the enemy in front of them. This is not a sophisticated system of leadership. It is not designed to inspire loyalty or build morale in any positive sense. It is designed to ensure compliance through the most direct means possible, and within the brutal logic of the Imperium's military structure, it works. These soldiers who might otherwise break and run under fire find themselves trapped between two deadly forces: the enemy ahead and the commissar behind. And in that trap, most choose to face the enemy because at least the enemy might miss. In the death corps of Krieg, this entire dynamic is inverted, and the inversion tells you more about the nature of the death corps than any amount of description could convey. Because in a death corps regiment, the commissar's role is not to prevent soldiers from running away. Death corps soldiers do not run away. The concept is as alien to them as the concept of breathing without a gas mask. The commissar's role in a death corps regiment is to prevent soldiers from dying unnecessarily, to restrain the death corps' suicidal tendencies rather than to overcome their cowardice, to keep them alive long enough to be useful rather than to prevent them from breaking and fleeing. Think about that for a moment. Let it settle. In every other regiment in the Astra Militarum, the commissar is there to make soldiers fight. In the death corps of Krieg, the commissar is there to make soldiers survive. The commissar assigned to a Krieg regiment spends their days not looking for soldiers who are shirking their duty, but looking for soldiers who are seeking death too eagerly. Soldiers who volunteer for suicide missions when their skills would be better employed elsewhere. Soldiers who advance beyond their designated positions in search of the enemy fire that will grant them the release they crave. Soldiers who refuse medical treatment for wounds that could be healed, preferring to bleed out in the trenches rather than accept the delay in their atonement that recovery would represent. The commissars who serve with death corps regiments are a special breed. They must be, because the role demands a psychological resilience that goes beyond what most commissars are trained for. A normal commissar deals with fear and its consequences. A death corps commissar deals with something far more unsettling: the complete absence of fear and the eagerness for death that replaces it. Many commissars who are assigned to death corps regiments for the first time report feeling profoundly disturbed by the experience, not because the soldiers are hostile or difficult, but because they are too compliant, too willing, too eager to throw themselves into situations that no rational human being would consider acceptable. There are accounts of commissars who, accustomed to the role of disciplinarian and executioner, find themselves completely at a loss when confronted with soldiers who would genuinely welcome the bolt round that most soldiers fear above all else. What do you threaten someone with when they have no fear of death? How do you enforce discipline on soldiers who are more afraid of surviving than of dying? The answer, which every Death Corps commissar eventually discovers, is that you do not threaten. You redirect. You channel the Death Corps' suicidal devotion toward objectives that will produce the maximum benefit for the Imperium's war effort, rather than allowing it to dissipate in meaningless sacrifices that accomplish nothing beyond adding another body to the count. The best Death Corps commissars learn to think of themselves not as disciplinarians, but as resource managers. Each soldier, under their authority, represents a finite but significant amount of military capability, training, equipment, experience, and the ability to kill the Emperor's enemies. A soldier who dies in a pointless charge against a fortified position that could have been reduced by artillery has wasted that capability. A soldier who holds their position under fire, kills as many enemies as possible, and then dies when the position is finally overrun has maximized it. The commissar's job is to ensure that the Death Corps' willingness to die is channeled into the latter scenario rather than the former. This resource management approach extends to the broader command structure of the Death Corps. Officers in a Death Corps regiment are not chosen for their charisma or their ability to inspire. They are chosen for their tactical competence and their understanding of the attritional calculus that governs all Death Corps operations. A good Death Corps officer knows exactly how many soldiers will need to die to take a given objective, and they plan their operations accordingly. They do not seek to minimize casualties in the way that officers in other regiments do. They seek to optimize them, to ensure that every death contributes to the achievement of the mission, and that no lives are wasted on objectives that are not worth the cost. The Watchmasters are a uniquely Krieg institution, non-commissioned officers who serve as the immediate supervisors of infantry squads and who bear a responsibility that goes beyond simple tactical leadership. The Watchmaster is the interface between the individual soldier and the larger military machine, the person who ensures that each soldier in their charge is performing their designated function and contributing to the overall effort. In other regiments, this role might be filled by a sergeant whose relationship with their soldiers includes elements of mentorship, camaraderie, and mutual respect. In the Death Corps, the Watchmaster's relationship with their soldiers is purely functional. They monitor performance. They identify and correct deficiencies. They ensure that equipment is properly maintained and that orders are properly followed. And when a soldier falls, they note the casualty in their reports and prepare for the replacement that will arrive to fill the gap. The Watchmasters are, in many ways, the truest embodiment of the Death Corps ethos. They are soldiers who have demonstrated sufficient competence to be given authority over others, but who exercise that authority with the same emotional detachment that characterizes all Death Corps interactions. They do not know their soldiers' names because their soldiers do not have names, only designations. They do not know their soldiers' histories because Krieg soldiers do not have personal histories, only service records. They know only that each soldier is a unit of capability to be deployed, maintained, and, when the time comes, expended in the service of the Emperor. But the broader command structure of a Death Corps regiment mirrors the standard Imperial Guard organizational template, with companies, platoons, and squads organized along familiar lines. But the culture that pervades this structure is unlike anything found in other regiments. Staff meetings are conducted with clinical precision, casualty projections presented with the same detachment that a logistics officer might use to discuss ammunition consumption. Tactical discussions focus on rates of advance and acceptable loss ratios, rather than the kind of creative problem-solving that characterizes planning sessions in more flexible regiments. The Death Corps do not improvise. They execute. Their plans are thorough, their preparations meticulous, and their commitment to the chosen course of action absolute, even when circumstances suggest that a different approach might be more efficient. This rigidity is both a strength and a weakness. It is a strength because it makes Death Corps operations extremely predictable, and predictability in military operations is valuable. Commanders who deploy Death Corps regiments know exactly what they are going to get. They know that the Krieg soldiers will advance to their designated objectives, hold those objectives until relieved or destroyed, and accept whatever casualties the operation requires without complaint or hesitation. There are no surprises with the Death Corps, no unexpected retreats, no sudden collapses in morale, no embarrassing incidents of troops refusing orders or breaking under fire. The Death Corps deliver exactly what they promise, every time, without fail. And it is a weakness because it makes the Death Corps vulnerable to enemies who can exploit their predictability. A clever opponent, one who understands the Death Corps' doctrine and anticipates their approach, can prepare defenses that maximize the cost of the Death Corps' standard attritional methods. They can set traps in the trench lines, booby-trap the positions they know the Krieg soldiers will assault, time their counterattacks to catch the Death Corps at their most vulnerable. The Death Corps' response to such tactics is not to adapt, but to persist, to absorb the additional casualties and continue the advance with the same relentless determination that they apply to every other obstacle. They will eventually overcome any defense, given enough time and enough bodies. The question is whether the cost is justified. And for the Death Corps, that question has only one answer. The cost is always justified because the cost is always atonement, and atonement is always worth the price. The relationship between the Death Corps and the broader Imperial military establishment is complex and often fraught with tension. On the level of high command, the Death Corps are valued assets. Imperial strategists and sector commanders appreciate the reliability and the sheer endurance that Death Corps regiments bring to a campaign. When a siege needs to be conducted, when a position needs to be held at any cost, when a war of attrition needs to be fought and won through the simple mathematics of expendable lives, the Death Corps are the first choice. Their reputation precedes them to every theatre of war, and that reputation, although it carries elements of horror and unease, also carries the assurance that the job will be done. On the level of the individual soldier, the relationship is more complicated. Soldiers from other regiments who find themselves fighting alongside the Death Corps often describe the experience in terms that suggest a deep and abiding discomfort. The Krieg soldiers' silence is unsettling. Their gas masks are dehumanizing. Their willingness to accept casualties is disturbing. Their lack of any visible emotional response to the horrors of combat, whether it be the death of a comrade or the sighting of a particularly terrifying enemy, creates an atmosphere of alienation that makes cooperation difficult on a personal level. There is a story, widely circulated among Imperial Guard veterans, though impossible to verify through official channels, about a Talon desert raider who found himself sharing a forward observation post with a Krieg soldier during a campaign on some forgotten world. The Talon, a naturally sociable soldier from a culture that values storytelling and camaraderie, attempted to make conversation with his companion during the long hours of their watch. He asked the Krieg soldier about their homeworld, about their family, about anything that might establish some common ground between them. The Krieg soldier listened to each question, considered it briefly, and then responded with the same answer each time. That information is not relevant to the mission, not hostile, not dismissive, simply factual. The Krieg soldier did not see the purpose of the questions because the questions had no bearing on the task at hand. They were on watch. Their duty was to observe the enemy's positions and report any changes. Everything else was noise, irrelevant data to be filtered and discarded. The Talon reportedly sat in silence for the remaining 4 hours of the watch, and when he was relieved, he told his sergeant that he would rather stand double watches alone than share another shift with one of the mask wearers. It was, he said, like being alone with a corpse that had forgotten to stop moving. This reaction is not unique. It appears in one form or another in virtually every account of interaction between Death Corps soldiers and personnel from other Imperial forces. The specific words vary, but the sentiment is always the same. There is something deeply wrong with these people, and spending time in their company is an experience that leaves lasting impressions on those who endure it. And yet, when the battle begins, when the shells start falling and the enemy comes charging out of the smoke, those same soldiers who found the death cause so disturbing in peacetime often find themselves profoundly grateful for their presence. Because whatever else the Death Corps may lack in terms of humanity and warmth, they more than make up for in reliability. They hold their positions. They follow their orders. They fight to the last. And in the chaos and terror of combat, when everything else is uncertain, and the only thing you can count on is that the situation is going to get worse before it gets better, having a force next to you that will not break, will not waver, will not flee, or is worth more than all the camaraderie in the galaxy. The Mechanicus, the vast techno-religious institution that maintains the Imperium's technology and worships the machine god, has a particular fascination with the Death Corps that borders on admiration. The tech priests who service the Death Corps equipment and maintain their vehicles see in the Krieg soldiers a reflection of their own ideals, the subordination of the flesh to function, the elimination of individual desire in favor of purpose, the pursuit of efficiency above all other considerations. Some Mechanicus scholars have even suggested that the Death Corps represent the ideal convergence of organic and mechanical, not through the literal replacement of flesh with metal, but through the psychological transformation of human beings into something that thinks and acts like a machine while still retaining the adaptability and initiative that true machines lack. Whether this assessment is flattering or horrifying depends entirely on your perspective, but it speaks to the fundamental truth about the Death Corps that sits at the center of their story. They have achieved, through cultural conditioning rather than surgical modification, a state of being that most human beings would consider a form of death. They have sacrificed their individuality, their emotions, their capacity for joy and love, and all the other things that make life worth living, in exchange for a kind of perfect or mechanical devotion that serves the Emperor's purposes with extraordinary effectiveness, but leaves nothing behind that could be called human. This is the price of fanaticism. Not the bodies in the trenches or the worlds bought with blood. The price is the humanity that was surrendered to pay for it. And it is a price that the people of Krieg have been paying for 10,000 years and will continue to pay for as long as the Imperium endures and the Emperor sits upon his golden throne. The question of what makes the Death Corps the most fanatical regiment in the Imperium demands that we consider the competition. And the competition is fierce, because the Imperium of man does not lack for devoted soldiers. Across 1 million worlds, under 1 billion different suns, there are regiments whose devotion to the Emperor is absolute, while whose willingness to sacrifice is total, whose commitment to the cause would make the most dedicated warriors of any other civilization look positively casual by comparison. To claim that the Death Corps of Krieg stand above all of these other forces is a bold statement, and it is one that deserves examination. Consider the Katakhan jungle fighters, born on a world that is literally trying to kill them from the moment they take their first breath. The Katakhans are among the toughest soldiers in the Imperium. Their planet is a death world where the vegetation is carnivorous, the insects are venomous, the predators are the size of tanks, and the temperature and humidity hover at levels that would incapacitate soldiers from temperate worlds within hours. A Katakhan who survives to adulthood has already proven themselves a warrior of exceptional capability, and the regiments that Katakhan produces are feared by every enemy they face. Their toughness is legendary. Their skill in close combat is unmatched among regular human soldiers. Their ability to operate independently in hostile environments makes them invaluable for the kind of asymmetric warfare that increasingly characterizes the Imperium's conflicts. But the Katakhans are not fanatical. They are tough, they are skilled, they are phenomenally dangerous, but they fight for different reasons than the Death Corps. A Katakhan fights because fighting is what they are good at, because the alternative is the boredom and purposelessness of peacetime on a world where peacetime is still incredibly dangerous, and because they genuinely enjoy the challenge of pitting their skills against whatever the galaxy throws at them. There is a joy in the Katakan approach to warfare, a savage delight in the struggle that is completely absent from the Death Corps' cold, mechanical devotion. Katakans want to live, they fight to survive, and they are very good at it. The Death Corps fight to die, and they are very good at that. Consider the Vostroyan Firstborn. Here is a regiment that, like the Death Corps, carries a burden of ancestral guilt. During the Horus Heresy, the war that nearly destroyed the Imperium 10,000 years ago, Vostroya refused to send troops to support the loyalist cause, keeping its skilled workers in the forges and factories that produced weapons for the war effort rather than committing them to the fighting. And when the heresy was over, and the traitors had been driven into the Eye of Terror, Vostroya found itself branded with the shame of having sat out the most important conflict in human history. To atone for this failure, Vostroya decreed that henceforth, every firstborn son of every family would be given to the Imperial Guard for military service. Hence the name, the Firstborn. The parallel with Krieg is obvious. Both worlds carry the weight of historical guilt. Both produce soldiers motivated by the desire to atone for the sins of their ancestors. But the nature of their guilt and the nature of their atonement could not be more different. The Vostroyans have incorporated their guilt into a system that preserves family bonds and individual identity. A Vostroyan Firstborn knows his name. He knows his family. Yet he knows the specific history of his world's failure and the specific way in which his service addresses it. He carries with him the expectations of a proud military tradition and the personal investment of a family that has given him up for a higher purpose. The Death Corps have done something entirely different with their guilt. They have used it to destroy the very concept of individual identity, to strip away everything personal and replace it with a collective devotion so total that it leaves no room for the individual to exist as anything other than a unit of expendable military capability. The Vostroyan Firstborn atone through service. The Death Corps atone through annihilation, the annihilation of the self, of individual desire, of everything that makes a human being a person rather than a weapon. Consider the Cadian shock troops, or rather, consider what they were before the fall of Cadia. The Cadians were, for most of Imperial history, considered the finest soldiers in the Astra Militarum. They were born on a world that sat at the very edge of the Eye of Terror, the great wound in reality from which the forces of chaos poured forth like poison from an infected wound. Every citizen of Cadia was a soldier from birth, trained in military skills before they could properly walk, drilled in the arts of war from the moment they were old enough to hold a weapon. The Cadian way of war was professional, disciplined, and extraordinarily effective, a blend of tactical flexibility and combat skill that made Cadian regiments the gold standard against which all other guard units were measured. The Cadians were devoted, certainly. Or you do not grow up in the shadow of the Eye of Terror without developing a strong opinion about the forces of chaos and a corresponding devotion to the Emperor who protects you from them. But Cadian devotion was a practical thing, grounded in the realities of their situation and expressed through professional military excellence rather than self-destructive sacrifice. A Cadian officer would not throw away the lives of their soldiers on a pointless charge when a better option existed. They would maneuver, adapt, find the weakness in the enemy's position, and exploit it with minimum cost and maximum effect. This is what made them great soldiers. It is also what makes them fundamentally different from the Death Corps. The Death Corps do not maneuver. They do not adapt. Whereas they do not seek the clever solution that preserves lives while achieving objectives. They advance, they take casualties, they replace their losses, and they continue to advance until the objective is taken or the regiment is destroyed. There is no flexibility in this approach, and there is no elegance. But there is a terrifying purity of purpose that the Cadians, for all their professionalism, could never match. The Cadians fought to win. The Death Corps fight to atone. And there is a fanaticism in the pursuit of atonement that the pursuit of mere victory can never match. Consider the Armageddon Steel Legion, forged in the fires of one of the Imperium's most devastating wars. The 3 wars for Armageddon, fought against massive orc invasions, had produced a population of soldiers hardened by decades of continuous warfare and equipped with the mechanized infantry doctrine that makes the Steel Legion one of the most effective mobile forces in the Imperial Guard. The Steel Legion fight with a fury born of personal experience, defending a homeworld that has been attacked repeatedly by one of the galaxy's most destructive Xenos threats. But the Steel Legion's fury is born of defense, of the desire to protect their home and their people from an enemy that has tried to destroy them multiple times. It is a reactive fury, triggered by specific threats and focused on specific objectives. The Death Corps' devotion is not reactive. It is not triggered by any specific threat. It is a permanent state of being, a constant, an unwavering commitment to atonement that exists independently of whatever enemy they happen to be facing at any given moment. The Steel Legion fight because they have to. The Death Corps fight because they believe they deserve to suffer, and that distinction makes all the difference. There are those who might argue that the most fanatical forces in the Imperium are not regiments of the Astra Militarum at all, but the Space Marines of the Adeptus Astartes. And it is true that the Space Marines represent a form of devotion that is, in its own way, absolute. They are genetically engineered super soldiers, their bodies and minds remade by arcane science and mystical ritual into living weapons of unmatched capability. They are the Emperor's Angels of Death, the finest warriors humanity has ever produced. And their dedication to their duty is written into their very DNA. But the Space Marines' devotion, while impressive, is a product of what they are rather than what they choose. A Space Marine is devoted to the Emperor because they have been made to be devoted, their loyalty reinforced by hypno-indoctrination, psycho-conditioning, and the chemical alterations that transform them from ordinary humans into something more than human. There is an element of compulsion in their devotion that, while effective, lacks the terrible voluntariness of the Death Corps' commitment. The Death Corps choose their fate. They are not genetically engineered or psycho-conditioned into compliance. They are human beings, ordinary, unmodified, unenhanced human beings, who have been raised in a culture that has convinced them, utterly and completely, that their lives have value only as currency to be spent in the Emperor's service. The Death Corps' fanaticism is more impressive precisely because it is achieved through cultural means rather than biological ones. It requires no enhancement, no modification, no special technology. It requires only guilt, and guilt is a resource that Krieg possesses in infinite supply. Even within the Adeptus Astartes, the chapter most often compared to the Death Corps for their fanaticism is the Black Templars. These Sons of Dawn wage an eternal crusade against the Emperor's enemies, refusing to maintain a homeworld and instead ranging across the galaxy in fleets of warships, seeking battle wherever it can be found. The Black Templars are zealots of the highest order, yet their devotion to the Emperor approaching worship in a way that makes even other Space Marine chapters uncomfortable. They fight with a fury and a passion that is unmatched among the Adeptus Astartes, and their crusading spirit drives them to seek out and destroy the enemies of mankind, wherever they may lurk. But even the Black Templars, for all their fervor, fight with a passion that the Death Corps lack. The Black Templars are angry. They are filled with righteous fury at the enemies of the Emperor, and that fury drives them to acts of incredible violence and heroism. The Death Corps are not angry. They are not filled with anything at all. Their devotion is not a fire that burns. It is a void that consumes. They do not fight with passion. They fight with purpose. And that purpose is as cold and mechanical as the trench systems in which they spend their lives. The Black Templars' fanaticism is loud, dramatic, visible. The Death Corps' fanaticism is silent, methodical, and all the more terrifying for its quietness. In the end, what sets the Death Corps apart from every other force in the Imperium, what earns them the title of the most fanatical regiment, is not any single quality, but the combination of qualities that define their existence. They are utterly committed to their duty. They are completely indifferent to their own survival. They are willing to accept casualties at rates that would destroy any other force. They are immune to the temptations of chaos, not through superior faith, but through the absence of the very qualities that chaos exploits. They are psychologically incapable of retreat, or surrender, or anything that might be interpreted as self-preservation at the expense of the mission. And they do all of this not because they have been engineered or conditioned or threatened into compliance, but because they genuinely, sincerely, absolutely believe that their lives are worth less than the objectives they are ordered to take. This is fanaticism in its purest form, not the wild-eyed, screaming, passionate fanaticism of zealots who believe they are fighting for a cause greater than themselves, but the quiet, cold, mechanical fanaticism of people who have accepted with absolute certainty that they do not deserve to exist, and that the best use of their existence is to end it in the most productive way possible. It is a fanaticism that does not need to be encouraged or motivated. It is self-sustaining, self-reinforcing, and self-perpetuating, passed from generation to generation through a culture that has been refining it for 10,000 years. The Departamento Munitorum, the Imperium's vast military logistics organization, has a classification system for the various regiments of the Astra Militarum. Regiments are categorized by their specialization, siege, assault, reconnaissance, garrison, and by their quality, from the elite formations that are deployed to the most critical war zones, to the conscript levies that are used to fill gaps in the line. Within this system, the death corps of Krieg occupy a unique position. They are classified as siege specialists, which accurately reflects their preferred mode of warfare, but fails to capture the full scope of their capabilities and their limitations. What the classification system does not capture, or what no bureaucratic system could capture, is the intangible quality that makes the death corps what they are. It does not capture the silence of a Krieg camp the night before an assault, when other regiments would be filled with the sounds of nervous conversation, of weapons being checked and rechecked, of prayers being whispered and farewells being spoken. In a Krieg camp, there is only the quiet, efficient preparation of soldiers who have already accepted their fate and see no reason to discuss it. It does not capture the sight of a Krieg regiment advancing across no man's land. Gas masks gleaming in the light of artillery explosions, greatcoats flapping in the wind generated by shell blasts, moving forward with a uniformity of pace and purpose that makes them look less like an army and more like a tide, as something elemental and unstoppable and utterly indifferent to the obstacles in its path. And it does not capture the moment after the battle when the survivors, if there are survivors, return to their trenches and begin the process of preparation for the next assault without a word of celebration or acknowledgement that they have survived something that should have killed them. Other soldiers might embrace their comrades, share a drink, offer a prayer of thanksgiving for their deliverance. Death Corps soldiers clean their weapons, check their ammunition, repair their equipment, and wait, because survival is not a victory for them. It is merely a delay, and the next opportunity for atonement is always just around the corner. This is the Death Corps of Krieg. And this is what fanaticism looks like when it has been perfected over 10,000 years of uninterrupted practice. And this is why, when the question is asked about which regiment in the vast, sprawling, impossibly complex military machine of the Imperium of man carries devotion to its absolute extreme, the answer is always the same. Always. Beings who are about to walk into fire together. A reminder that they were not alone, even if the culture that shaped them insisted that aloneness was the natural state of a soldier whose life was already forfeit. There are reports of Death Corps soldiers who, assigned to garrison duty on worlds far from the front lines, would stand for hours staring at the sky. Not with any apparent purpose. Not in the way that a watchful sentry scans the horizon for threats. Just standing, head tilted back, in looking up at something that their gas masks filtered into data rather than beauty. These soldiers were not defective. Their performance ratings were within acceptable parameters. They completed their duties and maintained their equipment and followed their orders with the same mechanical precision as every other Death Corps soldier. But in their off-duty hours, they looked at the sky, and one can only wonder what they were looking for. A memory of something their world had lost, a dream of something they had never been allowed to want, or simply the vastness of a universe that existed beyond the narrow confines of trenches and bunkers and the never-ending cycle of warfare and atonement. There is a particularly haunting account from a chaplain who served with the Death Corps during the later stages of the Siege of Vrax. The chaplain, whose name has been withheld from the official records at his own request, described an incident that occurred during a lull in the fighting, one of the rare moments of calm that punctuated the otherwise continuous violence of the siege. He had been making his rounds through the trench system, offering blessings and prayers to the soldiers who manned the forward positions, when he came upon a group of Death Corps soldiers gathered in a secondary trench. They were not on duty. They were not maintaining equipment or preparing for an assault. They were listening. One of their number, a soldier whose designation the chaplain did not record, was speaking in a low voice that barely carried above the background noise of distant artillery. The chaplain could not make out the words at first. He moved closer, keeping to the shadows of the trench wall, and gradually the soldier's voice became clear enough to understand. They were telling a story, not a tactical briefing, not a recitation of regulations, not any of the functional communications that comprise the normal verbal interactions within a Death Corps regiment. A story. Something about a figure who walked across a vast emptiness, searching for something they could not name, knowing only that it existed somewhere beyond the horizon, and that reaching it would make everything worthwhile. The chaplain listened for several minutes, fascinated by this unexpected display of creativity in a regiment that supposedly had none. The other soldiers sat motionless, their gas masks turned toward the speaker, their postures suggesting an attention that went beyond mere hearing. When the story ended, yet there was a long silence. Then, without a word, the soldiers rose and returned to their positions, and the moment was over as if it had never happened. The chaplain asked about the incident later, approaching one of the regiment's officers with as much tact as he could muster. The officer confirmed that such incidents were not unknown, though they were never officially acknowledged. Sometimes, the officer said, a soldier would speak of things that were not related to the mission. It happened rarely, and it never affected performance. The officer did not consider it a disciplinary matter. The way he said it suggested that he understood, on some level, that what these soldiers were doing was profoundly human, and that trying to suppress it completely would be both futile and wrong. These stories, these tiny fragments of humanity glimpsed through the cracks in the Death Corps' impenetrable facade, serve as reminders that the soldiers of Krieg are, despite everything that has been done to them and everything they have done to themselves, still human beings. They have been shaped by a culture of guilt and atonement so extreme that it has nearly erased their individuality. But the human spirit persists in ways that no amount of conditioning can entirely eliminate. Somewhere beneath the gas mask and the greatcoat, behind the numerical designation and the flat, mechanical voice, there is still a person. A person who was never given a name, who was never allowed to form attachments, who was never taught to value their own existence, but who occasionally, yes, in quiet moments when the war is distant and the weight of duty temporarily lightens, reaches towards something that the culture of Krieg insists does not exist. These moments do not redeem Krieg's system. They do not make the Death Corps' dehumanization acceptable or their culture of self-destruction admirable. But they do remind us that the Death Corps are not machines, no matter how hard they try to be. They are people, damaged, suppressed, conditioned people, but people nonetheless. And the persistence of their humanity, however diminished, however deeply buried, is perhaps the most remarkable thing about them. Because if the architects of Krieg's culture The chaplains and officers and institutional systems that have spent 10,000 years trying to transform human beings into perfect expendable weapons, have failed to completely eliminate the human spark, even after all that time and all that effort. Then perhaps the human spirit is more resilient than anyone in the 41st millennium gives it credit for. Perhaps the soldier who sat beside their fallen cohort companion in the captured trench, the soldiers who stared at alien skies during garrison duty, the storyteller who spun tales of journeys toward unnamed horizons. Perhaps these small acts of defiance against the crushing weight of institutional guilt represent something important, something that the death cause would never acknowledge and that Krieg's culture would never celebrate, but that exists nonetheless, stubbornly, quietly, in the spaces between orders and obligations and the endless grinding pursuit of atonement, whether this residual humanity makes the death cause more tragic or more admirable is a question that each of us must answer for ourselves. But its existence adds a dimension to their story that purely mechanical devotion could never provide. The Death Corps are not just the most fanatical regiment in the Imperium. They are also, in their own suppressed and unacknowledged way, among the most human. And that paradox, the coexistence of absolute self-denial and persistent human feeling, is what makes their story one of the most compelling in all of Warhammer 40,000. Let us now speak of how the Death Corps view themselves, which is a question that reveals as much about the nature of self-awareness within a culture of collective guilt as it does about the specific beliefs and values of Krieg's soldiers. Because the Death Corps do have a self-image, despite the efforts of their culture to eliminate the concept of self entirely. It is not the rich, complex, individualized self-image that a soldier from another regiment might possess. It is simpler, starker, more like a geometric shape than a portrait. But it exists, and understanding it is essential to understanding why the Death Corps do what they do. At the center of the Death Corps' self-image is the concept of the debt. Not a financial debt, not a social debt, not the kind of obligation that can be discharged through specific actions and then set aside. The debt is metaphysical. It is the accumulated weight of Krieg's betrayal, measured not in currency, but in souls. And it applies to every citizen of Krieg regardless of when they were born, what they have done, or how they have served. The debt is infinite. It can never be fully repaid, but it can be reduced, one life at a time, and the process of reducing it is the only activity that gives a Krieg citizen's existence any meaning. This concept of the debt shapes everything about how the Death Corps operate. It explains their willingness to accept casualties, because each casualty is a payment against the debt. It explains their indifference to personal survival, because personal survival means the debt remains unpaid for one more day. It explains their lack of interest in glory or recognition, because glory is a reward, and the Death Corps do not believe they deserve rewards. They deserve only the opportunity to serve and the privilege of dying in that service. The debt also explains the Death Corps' relationship with time, which is unlike that of any other regiment in the Imperium. For most soldiers, time is something to be endured between battles and cherished outside of them. Time is the space where life happens, where connections are formed, where memories are made. For the Death Corps, time is simply the medium through which the debt continues to accumulate. Every moment that passes without a payment being made is a moment wasted. Every hour of peace is an hour in which the debt grows larger rather than smaller. The Death Corps do not welcome rest or respite. They endure it, waiting for the next call to duty with the same impatient patience that a debtor feels while waiting for the opportunity to make their next payment. This creates a psychology that is fundamentally different from that of any other military force in history. Then most soldiers fight when called upon and rest when allowed. The Death Corps fight when called upon and wait when forced to. There is no rest for them, only waiting. And the waiting is its own form of suffering, a slow accumulation of unused life that adds to the debt with every passing moment and makes the next battle, the next opportunity for atonement, feel increasingly urgent. It is worth noting that the Death Corps do not articulate these beliefs in the philosophical terms that we have been using. They do not sit around discussing the nature of the debt or the metaphysics of atonement. These concepts are so deeply embedded in their culture that they do not need to be articulated. They are assumed. They are the water in which every Krieg citizen swims, are so pervasive and so fundamental that questioning them would be like questioning the need to breathe. A Krieg soldier does not think about why they welcome death. They simply welcome it, the way a river flows toward the sea, naturally, inevitably, without reflection or hesitation. This lack of self-reflection is, paradoxically, one of the things that makes the Death Corps so effective. Soldiers who think too deeply about why they fight can sometimes lose the certainty that makes them willing to fight at all. Doubt is the enemy of action, and the Death Corps have no doubt because they have no space in their psychological architecture for doubt to take root. They know what they are, they know what they must do, and they do it, over and over again, generation after generation, century after century, millennium after millennium, and with a consistency that is both magnificent and heartbreaking. The ecclesiarchy has, over the millennia, attempted to incorporate the Death Corps' unique brand of devotion into the broader framework of imperial faith. Some theologians have held up the Death Corps as the ultimate expression of the Emperor's will, proof that human beings can transcend their selfish individual concerns and devote themselves entirely to a cause greater than themselves. Others have argued that the Death Corps' brand of devotion is actually a perversion of the Emperor's message, that the God Emperor intended for his servants to find purpose and meaning in their lives, not to treat those lives as worthless currency to be spent as quickly as possible. The debate is, in typical imperial fashion, unresolvable, because neither side can claim definitive knowledge of what the Emperor actually intended. But the debate itself is revealing because it highlights the fundamental tension at the heart of the Death Corps' existence. Are they the most faithful servants of the Emperor, or the most damaged? Are they the ideal to which all soldiers should aspire, or a cautionary tale about what happens when guilt is allowed to consume an entire civilization? Are they heroes or victims? The answer, of course, is that they are both. And that duality, that coexistence of heroism and victimhood, of magnificent devotion and profound damage, is what makes the Death Corps of Krieg one of the most compelling and thought-provoking creations in the entire Warhammer 40,000 universe. But what the Death Corps tell us about the Imperium itself is perhaps more important than what they tell us about any single regiment or any single world. Because the Death Corps of Krieg are not an aberration within the Imperium's vast military machine. They are, in a very real sense, the Imperium's values taken to their logical extreme. Everything that the Imperium preaches about duty, sacrifice, obedience, and the subordination of the individual to the greater good, the Death Corps practice, with a commitment that no other force can match. They are what happens when the Imperium's ideology is stripped of its comforting fictions and reduced to its bare, uncomfortable essence. The Imperium tells its citizens that their lives belong to the Emperor. The Death Corps believe it. The Imperium tells its soldiers that duty supersedes self-interest, while the Death Corps have eliminated self-interest entirely. The Imperium tells its people that sacrifice is the highest virtue. The Death Corps have made sacrifice the only virtue. In every case, the Death Corps are simply taking the Imperium's own teachings and applying them with a literalness that the Imperium's leaders never intended and often find deeply uncomfortable. This is the mirror that the Death Corps hold up to the Imperium, and the reflection is not flattering. Because if the Death Corps' dehumanization is disturbing, if their willingness to die is troubling, if their reduction of human beings to expendable military resources is horrifying, then what does that say about the system that created them? Well, what does it say about an Imperium that produces a world like Krieg, and then harvests the soldiers it produces without questioning the process that makes them what they are? What does it say about a civilization that classifies the complete destruction of human individuality as an asset rather than a tragedy? The answer is that it says exactly what the Imperium has always said about itself, though it rarely says it so clearly. The Imperium of man is not a civilization that values human life. It is a civilization that values human utility. A human life that serves the Imperium's purposes is valuable. A human life that does not serve those purposes is expendable. The Death Corps understand this calculation better than anyone, because they have internalized it so completely that it has become their identity. They are the Imperium's ID, at the raw, unfiltered expression of values that most imperial institutions dress up in the language of faith and duty and honor to make them palatable. And this is why the Death Corps disturb even the most loyal servants of the Emperor. Not because they are strange or alien or incomprehensible, but because they are familiar. Because every soldier in the Imperial Guard, when they look at the Death Corps, sees a version of themselves taken one step further than they are comfortable going. The Catachan sees their toughness stripped of its joy. The Cadian sees their discipline stripped of its pride. The Vostroyan sees their guilt stripped of its personal context. The Death Corps are what every regiment would become if the comforting fictions were removed and only the cold, hard truth remained. Yeah, this is why the Imperium tolerates the Death Corps' methods despite the moral questions they raise. Because to question the Death Corps is to question the Imperium itself. And that is a line that no loyal servant is willing to cross. Better to accept the gas masks and the silence and the casualty rates that would make an accountant weep. Better to look the other way when another regiment of faceless soldiers marches into the transport ships on their way to another world, where another percentage of them will die without anyone learning their names. Better to classify it all as service and sacrifice, and move on to the next item on the agenda. Because the alternative, the possibility that the Imperium's methods might be wrong, that there might be a better way to organize human civilization than as a vast machine that grinds lives into military capability, is a thought too dangerous and too destabilizing to entertain. The visual language of the Death Corps is, by itself, a masterwork of storytelling that communicates their nature without a single word of exposition. The designers who created the Death Corps drew heavily from the imagery of the First World War, the conflict that, more than any other in human history, demonstrated the futility and the horror of attritional warfare. The gas masks, the trench coats, the trench systems, the artillery bombardments, the cavalry charges into machine gun fire, all of these elements are drawn directly from the battlefields of 1914 to 1918, and they carry with them the accumulated emotional weight of that conflict's legacy. The First World War was, for the generation that fought it, a transformative experience that shattered the old certainties about glory and honor in warfare, and replaced them with a new understanding of what industrial-scale violence actually looked like. The soldiers who marched into the trenches of the Western Front, carrying expectations of adventure and valor, found instead a grinding, mechanical process of killing that reduced them to statistics, interchangeable units of manpower to be fed into the machine and ground down to nothing. The poetry and the literature that emerged from the trenches spoke of futility, of waste, of the terrible distance between the patriotic rhetoric of the home front and the reality of life and death in no man's land. So the Death Corps inherit all of this. When you look at a Death Corps soldier, you are looking at a figure that deliberately evokes the soldiers of Verdun and the Somme, of Passchendaele and Gallipoli. The gas mask recalls the chemical warfare that turned the Western Front into a toxic nightmare. The greatcoat recalls the soldiers who huddled in waterlogged trenches, waiting for the order to advance that they knew would likely be their last. The trench systems recall the elaborate networks of fortifications that characterized a war, where neither side could gain a decisive advantage, and the front lines barely moved for years at a time. By transplanting these images into the far future of Warhammer 40,000, the creators of the Death Corps made a statement about the nature of war that transcends the fictional boundaries of the setting. They said, in essence, that the lessons of the First World War have not been learned, that 10,000 years in the future, humanity is still making the same mistakes, still grinding its young into the mud of no man's land, still measuring progress in meters gained and lives lost. The death course are a warning wrapped in fiction, a reminder that the horror of attritional warfare is not a relic of the past, but a possibility that exists wherever human beings choose to solve their problems through the organized application of violence. But the death cause also incorporate elements that go beyond the First World War parallel. Their culture of atonement, their reduction of individual identity to numerical designation, their acceptance of death as a positive good rather than a necessary evil. These elements draw from a wider range of historical and philosophical sources. There are echoes of military cultures throughout history that have embraced death as a path to honor or redemption. There are echoes of religious traditions that have valued martyrdom above survival. There are echoes of totalitarian systems that have sought to subsume the individual into the collective and to replace personal identity with institutional loyalty. The genius of the death cause as a fictional creation is that they combine all of these elements into a single, coherent concept that feels both fantastic and disturbingly real. They are too extreme to be mistaken for a real military force, but they are grounded enough in real human behavior and real historical patterns to feel plausible. We can look at the death cause and say, mired with uncomfortable certainty, that if the conditions were right, if the guilt were deep enough and the conditioning thorough enough and the circumstances desperate enough, this is what human beings might actually become. And that plausibility is what gives the death cause their power as a narrative and thematic device. They are not just soldiers in a tabletop game. They are a thought experiment, an exploration of what happens when duty is taken to its absolute extreme, when sacrifice becomes an end in itself rather than a means to an end, when the individual is so thoroughly subsumed by the collective that nothing remains but function and the ghost of a guilt that no amount of dying can erase. The death cause also raise questions about the nature of heroism that challenge conventional understanding. In most narrative traditions, a hero is someone who overcomes fear, who makes choices in the face of danger, who demonstrates courage and leadership and the kind of individual virtue that inspires others to follow. The death call possess none of these qualities, at least not in the traditional sense. They do not overcome fear because they do not experience it. They do not make choices because their culture has eliminated the concept of personal choice. They do not demonstrate individual virtue because individuality has been stripped from them so thoroughly that there is no individual left to be virtuous. And yet, there is something heroic about them. Not in the way that a single warrior performing a daring deed is heroic, but in the way that a mountain standing against a storm is heroic, in the way that a wall holding back a flood is heroic, and in the way that something that simply endures, that refuses to be moved or broken or worn away, despite every force that presses against it, possesses a kind of heroism that is all the more powerful for being unconscious and unintentional. The death cause endure. That is their heroism. They endure conditions that would destroy other forces. They endure losses that would shatter other armies. They endure a spiritual and psychological burden that would crush any individual who tried to carry it alone. And they endure it for millennia, generation after generation, century after century, without complaint, without wavering, without ever questioning whether the burden they carry is fair or whether the price they pay is just. They endure because endurance is all they know. And in a galaxy where the enemies of mankind are limitless and the war is never over, endurance may be the most heroic quality of all. There is a poetry to the death cause existence that sits alongside the horror and the tragedy. It is not a comfortable poetry. It does not rhyme, and it does not scan, and it does not leave you feeling uplifted or inspired. It is the poetry of endurance, of persistence, of the stubborn refusal to stop fighting, even when fighting has lost all meaning beyond the act itself. It is the poetry of the trench, where the world is reduced to a narrow strip of sky overhead and a wall of mud on either side, and the only direction that matters is forward, and the only question that matters is whether you will take one more step before the end comes. In the grand mythology of Warhammer 40,000, the Death Corps of Krieg occupy a unique space. They are not the strongest fighters, they are not the most skilled tacticians, they are not the most inspiring leaders. They are none of the things that typically define a legendary military force. What they are is the most committed, the most willing, the most accepting of the price that war demands. And in a universe where the price of survival is measured in blood, and the currency of devotion is measured in bodies, that commitment is worth more than all the skill and strength and tactical brilliance in the galaxy. They are the guardsmen who will not stop, the soldiers who will not break, the regiment that will hold the line when every other force has fallen back, that will advance when every other unit has gone to ground, that will fight to the last breath and the last round and the last swing of an entrenching tool in a muddy trench on a world whose name they never bothered to learn. They are the Death Corps of Krieg, and they are everything that the Imperium of man needs them to be, even if what the Imperium needs them to be is something that should never have existed in the first place. Let us speak, before we close this chapter of our exploration, about what the Death Corps mean to those who encounter them in the context of the hobby itself. Because the Death Corps of Krieg are not just characters in a story, they are miniatures on a tabletop. They are models painted with loving care by hobbyists who are drawn to their aesthetic, their lore, and the questions they raise about the nature of duty and sacrifice, and the cost of fanatical devotion. And they are one of the most popular and enduring factions in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. And their popularity tells us something about why this particular story resonates so deeply with the people who engage with it. The appeal of the Death Corps is multifaceted. On a purely visual level, they are stunning. The gas masks, the greatcoats, the Death Rider cavalry, the artillery batteries, the trench systems, all of it combines to create an aesthetic that is immediately recognizable and powerfully evocative. They look like nothing else in the Warhammer 40,000 range, and their visual distinctiveness makes them stand out on the tabletop in a way that few other factions can match. But the visual appeal is only part of the story. The deeper appeal of the Death Corps lies in the questions they raise, the uncomfortable truths they illuminate, and the emotional response they provoke in people who engage with their lore. There is something about the Death Corps that gets under your skin that makes you think about issues of duty and sacrifice and identity in ways that a more conventional military faction never would. They challenge you to consider what fanaticism really looks like, not the wild-eyed, screaming kind that we usually associate with the word, but the quiet, cold, methodical kind that is far more terrifying and far more effective. They also challenge you to consider the cost of the virtues that we typically celebrate in military contexts. Duty, sacrifice, obedience, loyalty. These are all qualities that we are taught to admire, and the Death Corps embody them to a degree that should make us uncomfortable. Because if we admire duty, yet we must confront the fact that the Death Corps' duty has consumed their humanity. If we admire sacrifice, we must confront the fact that the Death Corps' sacrifice is pathological rather than noble. If we admire obedience, we must confront the fact that the Death Corps' obedience has eliminated their capacity for independent thought. The Death Corps force us to examine the limits of virtues that we usually accept without question, and that examination is uncomfortable but necessary. In this way, the Death Corps serve the same function that the best science fiction has always served. They use the exaggeration and distortion of a fictional setting to illuminate truths about the real world that would be difficult to see in their natural context. The Death Corps are not real, but the questions they raise are. What do we owe to the sins of our ancestors? How much of ourselves are we willing to sacrifice in the name of duty? At what point does devotion become self-destruction? Where is the line between heroism and madness? These are questions that have no easy answers, and the Death Corps' existence is a constant reminder that the answers matter. Before we reach our conclusion, let us return one last time to the place where all of this began. Let us return to Krieg itself, to the world that was murdered by its own loyal son, and then spent 10,000 years producing soldiers from its corpse. Because to truly appreciate what the Death Corps are, you must understand the world that shapes them, not as it existed before the rebellion, not as it was during the Civil War, but as it exists now in the 41st millennium, 10,000 years after Colonel Jurten's nuclear fire turned a prosperous hive world into a permanent monument to the cost of loyalty. The surface of Krieg is, by any standard that a human being might apply, uninhabitable. The atmosphere is a toxic soup of chemical residue, radioactive particulates, and the accumulated byproducts of 10 millennia of industrial activity conducted with little regard for environmental impact. The sky, when it can be seen through the perpetual haze of pollution and ash, is a sickly yellowish grey that has not changed colour in recorded memory. The ground is a mixture of compacted ash, irradiated soil, and the crushed remnants of the civilization that once stood upon it. Nothing grows on the surface of Krieg. Nothing lives there that was not specifically engineered to survive in conditions that would kill most organic life within hours. The temperature fluctuates wildly between extremes that would be lethal to unprotected humans. During what passes for daytime, when the weak light of Krieg's sun filters through the atmospheric haze, the surface temperature can rise to levels that cause exposed skin to blister and conventional equipment to overheat. During the long nights, the temperature drops so far below freezing that standing water, if there were any standing water, would freeze solid within minutes. The wind carries particles of ash and chemical residue that can strip the protective coating from equipment and eat through the filters of gas masks that are not properly maintained. This is the world that produces the Death Corps. This is the cradle in which they are raised, the environment that shapes them from their first breath to their last. And it is important to understand that the harshness of Krieg's environment is not incidental to the nature of its soldiers. It is fundamental. A child raised on Krieg learns, from the very beginning of their existence, that the world is hostile, that survival requires constant effort and eternal vigilance. That comfort is a luxury that does not exist and should not be expected. That the only constants in life are duty and death, and that one leads inevitably to the other. The population of Krieg lives entirely underground, in the vast network of habitation complexes, manufactorums, training facilities, and military installations that riddle the planet's crust, like the tunnels of some enormous burrowing organism. Yet these complexes are the descendants of the original hive infrastructure that survived Colonel Jurten's nuclear bombardment, expanded and modified over 10,000 years to accommodate the needs of a society that has been organized entirely around the production of soldiers. Life in the underground complexes is Spartan in the extreme. There is no concept of personal space on Krieg, no private quarters or individual possessions beyond what is necessary for military function. Citizens sleep in communal dormitories, eat in communal mess halls, train in communal facilities, and perform their duties in communal workspaces. Every aspect of daily life is regimented, scheduled, and monitored to ensure maximum efficiency. There is no leisure time in the way that citizens of other worlds would understand it. Sure, when a Krieg citizen is not actively training, working, or performing some other designated function, they are expected to be resting. And rest on Krieg is understood to mean the maintenance of physical readiness for the next period of activity, not the pursuit of personal enjoyment or recreation. The food on Krieg is produced by underground protein vats and hydroponic facilities that convert recycled organic material into the bland, nutritionally complete paste that constitutes the standard Krieg diet. There is no variety in this diet. There are no meals prepared with care or served with any consideration for taste or presentation. Food is fuel, nothing more, consumed in the minimum time necessary and in the minimum quantity required to maintain physical function. The concept of enjoying food, of savoring a meal, as of looking forward to eating as a pleasurable activity, is as foreign to a Krieg citizen as the concept of sunlight or fresh air. Water is similarly treated as a pure utility. Krieg's underground aquifers, contaminated by millennia of radioactive fallout, are filtered and recycled through systems that remove the worst of the contamination, but leave the water with a flat, metallic taste that would be unpleasant to anyone not raised on it. Water is rationed, allocated in precise quantities based on physiological need rather than personal preference. Waste of water, like waste of any resource, is treated as a serious offense, not because water is scarce in absolute terms, but because waste is a moral failing on Krieg, a symptom of the self-indulgence that led to the rebellion. The children of Krieg, or whether born naturally or produced through the Vitae womb program, enter this system from the moment they arrive in the world. There is no period of infancy in the way that other cultures understand it. Krieg children are assessed for physical and cognitive capability as soon as they are viable, sorted into training tracks based on their assessed potential, and placed into the educational program that will shape them into the soldiers they are destined to become. The educational program is entirely military in content and purpose. There is no literature, there is no art, there is no music, except for the martial hymns and dirges that accompany religious ceremonies and serve as the soundtrack to a childhood that is, in every meaningful sense, a prolonged boot camp. The children learn to march before they learn to read. They learn to handle weapons before they learn to write. They learn the doctrines of the Imperial cult, filtered through Krieg's unique interpretation of guilt and atonement, before they learn anything about the wider galaxy or the civilizations that inhabit it. By the time a Krieg child reaches the age that other worlds would consider the threshold of adulthood, they have already been through years of physical conditioning, weapons training, and psychological preparation that would be considered extreme even by the standards of the most militarized societies in the Imperium. The result of this upbringing is a population that is, in a very real sense, purpose-built for war. Not genetically modified, like the Space Marines, not cybernetically enhanced, like the Skitarii of the Mechanicus, but culturally engineered, as shaped from birth by an environment and an educational system that produces soldiers with the same reliability and consistency that a factory produces ammunition. Each Krieg citizen who emerges from the training pipeline is a standardized product, a unit of military capability that can be slotted into any position within the Death Corps' organizational structure and expected to perform with the precision and reliability that 10,000 years of refinement have made possible. This consistency is one of the Death Corps' greatest strengths. In most regiments, the quality of individual soldiers varies significantly. Some are braver than others. Some are more skilled. Some are more motivated. This variability creates challenges for commanders who must account for the human element in their planning. As building contingencies around the possibility that some units will perform better than expected and others will perform worse. In the Death Corps, this variability is essentially eliminated. Every soldier performs at the same level. Every unit functions with the same efficiency. The commanders of the Death Corps can plan their operations with a mathematical precision that would be impossible in any other regiment, because they know, with absolute certainty, that their soldiers will do exactly what they are told to do, exactly when they are told to do it, without variation or deviation. But this consistency comes at a cost, and the cost is the same one that we have been discussing throughout this entire exploration, the cost of humanity. Because to produce soldiers of perfect consistency, you must first eliminate the inconsistencies that make human beings human. The joy, the sorrow, the love, the anger, the hope, the fear, all the chaotic, unpredictable, gloriously messy emotions that make each human being unique. These are the inconsistencies that Krieg's system is designed to remove. And remove them it does, with a thoroughness that is both admirable and horrifying. The children of Krieg do not play. They train. They do not dream. They prepare. They do not hope for a future that is different from their present. They accept that their future will be exactly like their present, only with more death and more opportunity for atonement. This acceptance is not resignation. It is not the weary surrender of people who have given up on the possibility of a better life. It is a genuine and deeply held belief that the life they have been given is exactly the life they deserve, and that the only way to make it meaningful is to end it in the Emperor's service. And so the cycle continues. Children are born, children are trained, children become soldiers, soldiers are deployed, soldiers fight, soldiers die, and in the underground complexes of a dead world, new children are already being prepared to take their place, wearing the same gas masks, the same greatcoats, carrying the same lace guns and the same guilt, marching toward the same destiny with the same mechanical determination that has defined the Death Corps for 10,000 years. The surface of Krieg remains dead. The sky remains grey. The wind still carries ash and poison across an endless expanse of craters and ruins. But beneath the surface, the factories hum, and the training grounds echo with the sound of weapons fire, and the people of Krieg continue to do what they have always done, what they will always do, for as long as the Emperor's wars demand soldiers who will fight without hope, serve without reward, and die without complaint. This is Krieg. This is home. And for the Death Corps, it is enough. It has to be enough, because it is all they have ever known, and all they will ever know, and in the grim darkness of the far future, knowing enough is a luxury that most people can only dream of. The Death Corps of Krieg do not dream. But if they did, one wonders whether their dreams would show them the world that Krieg might have been, if the autarch had never rebelled, if the nuclear fire had never fallen, if the guilt had never taken root, a world of light instead of darkness, and of laughter instead of silence, of names instead of numbers, and faces instead of masks. But that world is gone, if it ever truly existed, and the world that replaced it has been shaping soldiers for longer than most civilizations have existed. The Death Corps do not look back. They do not look forward. They look only at the ground in front of them, at the next trench, the next objective, the next step in the endless march toward atonement. And they take that step, as they have always taken it, with the quiet, implacable, terrible determination that makes them the most fanatical soldiers the galaxy has ever known. There is a moment in every account of the Death Corps, whether it be an official campaign history filed with the Departamento Munitorum, or a whispered tale shared between veterans over a flask of Amasec in some far-flung cantina, where the narrator pauses, where the flow of words about tactics and casualties and siege lines gives way to something quieter, something that is not so easily captured in the language of military reports and strategic assessments. It is the moment when the narrator confronts the simple, irreducible fact of what the Death Corps are, and finds that all the words in the Gothic language are not quite sufficient to express the mixture of awe and pity and unease that the realization brings. Because the Death Corps are, ultimately, a tragedy, not a small tragedy, the kind that befalls individuals and can be mourned and then moved past. A civilizational tragedy, a species-level tragedy, a tragedy that encompasses an entire world and every soul it has ever produced, stretching across millennia and showing no signs of ever reaching a resolution. As Krieg betrayed the Emperor, that is the original sin, the wound from which all else flows. And in the 10,000 years since that betrayal, the people of Krieg have been trying to heal that wound with the only medicine they know, which is blood. Their own blood. Oceans of it. Rivers and lakes and seas of blood, spilled across 1,000 worlds in 1,000 campaigns, and none of it enough. The wound is still there. The guilt is still there. The debt is still there, as vast and as insurmountable as it was on the day the autarch first turned away from the Emperor's light. The tragedy is not that the Death Corps fight and die. In the 41st millennium, everyone fights and dies. The tragedy is that the Death Corps fight and die, believing that their deaths are the price of a sin they did not commit. A sin committed by ancestors so distant that they might as well be characters in a myth. The tragedy is that they have been so thoroughly conditioned by their culture that they cannot conceive of an existence that is not defined by guilt, cannot imagine a purpose that is not rooted in atonement, cannot value their own lives for any reason other than the fact that those lives can be exchanged for the opportunity to serve. The tragedy is that the death corps are prisoners, not of an external force, not of a tyrannical government or a hostile enemy, but of their own belief system. And it is a belief system that they cling to with the desperation of drowning swimmers, because without it, they would have nothing. No identity, no purpose, no reason to exist at all. This is what makes the Death Corps the most fanatical regiment in the Imperium. And not just the willingness to die, though that willingness is absolute and unwavering. Not just the indifference to individual survival, though that indifference is genuine and profound. It is the totality of it, the completeness, the way that fanaticism has become so intertwined with identity that separating them would destroy both. A Death Corps soldier cannot stop being fanatical because being fanatical is all they are. Take away the guilt, and you take away the purpose. Take away the purpose, and you take away the person. There is nothing else left. The fanaticism is not a layer that has been applied over a human being. It is the human being. It is all that remains after everything else has been burned away by centuries of conditioned guilt and relentless grinding warfare. And yet the death corps persist, generation after generation. They emerge from the underground complexes of their ruined homeworld, don their gas masks and their greatcoats, check their laser guns and their entrenching tools, and board the transports that will carry them to whatever corner of the galaxy the Emperor needs them. They do not complain, they do not question, they do not hesitate. They simply go, carrying with them the weight of a world's sin and the determination to reduce it by one more body, one more battle, one more death offered up to the God Emperor, in the hope that somewhere, somehow, the scales will be balanced and the debt will be paid. 10,000 years. That is how long the Death Corps have been fighting. 10,000 years of uninterrupted service, 10,000 years of blood and sacrifice, and the slow, grinding expenditure of human lives that constitutes their entire reason for existing. In that time, the Death Corps have fought in campaigns across every segmentum of the Imperium. They have faced every enemy that the galaxy has to offer, from the barbaric green tide of the Orcs to the insidious corruption of chaos, from the ancient cunning of the Eldar to the ravenous hunger of the tyrannid hive fleets. They have fought on worlds of ice and worlds of fire, in the void of space and in the bowels of hive cities, in deserts and jungles, and on the blasted plains of worlds that were already dead before the first shot was fired. And in all that time, in all those campaigns, in all those billions of battles fought by billions of faceless, nameless soldiers, the Death Corps have never once wavered. They have never retreated from a position they were ordered to hold. They have never refused an order, no matter how suicidal. They have never broken under fire, no matter how intense. They have never surrendered, no matter how hopeless the situation. They have maintained their standard of absolute, unquestioning devotion through every circumstance that the galaxy has thrown at them, and they have done it with a consistency that borders on the supernatural. How? How is it possible for a military force composed of ordinary human beings, not genetically modified super soldiers, not cybernetically enhanced killing machines, not psychers or sanctioned abhumans or any other category of enhanced warrior, but plain, unmodified baseline human beings, to maintain that level of commitment for that length of time? The answer lies in the culture, in the system that Krieg has built over 10 millennia, a system so comprehensive, so pervasive, and so ruthlessly efficient that it produces soldiers of absolute reliability with the same predictability that a factory produces ammunition. The system takes in raw human material, children born or decanted into the underground complexes of a dead world, and it transforms them into the Death Corps through a process that begins at birth and does not end until death. Every moment of a Krieg citizen's life is part of the process. Every breath they take, every meal they eat, every word they hear, every lesson they learn is calibrated to reinforce the beliefs and behaviors that make the death cause what they are. The system is self-perpetuating. It does not require external oversight or correction. The people of Krieg maintain it themselves, and not because they have been forced to, but because they believe in it with the same absolute certainty that they believe in the Emperor's divinity. The chaplains preach the doctrine of guilt and atonement because they genuinely believe that Krieg's sin is real and that only blood can pay for it. The officers enforce the regulations that strip away individuality because they genuinely believe that individuality is the weakness that led to the rebellion. The soldiers accept their role as expendable resources because they genuinely believe that their lives have no value beyond their utility to the Emperor's cause. There is no conspiracy here, no secret elite manipulating the masses for their own benefit. The system works because everyone within it, from the highest-ranking officer to the lowest-numbered infantry soldier, shares the same belief in the same principles. It is a self-sustaining engine of devotion, fueled by guilt and maintained by faith. And it has been running for 10,000 years without showing any signs of slowing down. The Imperium, for its part, has no reason to interfere with the system. The death cause produce exactly what the Imperium needs: soldiers who will go anywhere, fight anything, and accept any level of casualties without complaint. The moral questions that the system raises are irrelevant to the administratum, which measures value in terms of military output rather than human well-being. The ethical concerns that a more enlightened civilization might raise about the systematic dehumanization of an entire world's population are, in the context of the Imperium's brutal pragmatism, curiosities rather than crises. The system works, the soldiers fight, the wars are won, or at least not lost. What else matters? What else matters? It is a question that echoes through the halls of Krieg's underground complexes, through the trenches of 1,000 war zones, through the silence of the deep halls where the death cause honored dead are remembered not by name, but by designation. What else matters beyond duty, beyond sacrifice, beyond the endless, grinding effort to repay a debt that can never truly be repaid? The answer, the one that the death cause would never give because their culture has not equipped them to give it, is everything. Everything else matters. The joy of friendship matters. The warmth of family matters. The satisfaction of a life lived for its own sake, rather than as a down payment on someone else's sin matters. The ability to look at a sunset and feel something other than the tactical implications of reduced visibility matters. The capacity to hear music and be moved by it, to taste food and enjoy it, to touch another human being and feel the connection that makes us more than just mechanisms of flesh and bone, all of it matters. But these are things that the death cause have forfeited. These are the prices they have paid for their fanaticism, and they have paid them so thoroughly and for so long that most of them do not even know what they have lost. They cannot miss what they never had. They cannot mourn what they were never taught to value. They can only continue to serve, continue to fight, continue to die, in the hope that each death brings them one step closer to a redemption that, in truth, they may have already earned 1,000 times over without knowing it. Because here is the final, cruel irony of the death cause existence. The sin they are atoning for, the rebellion of the autarch, the betrayal of the Emperor's trust, was committed by a single individual and a small group of collaborators 10,000 years ago. The vast majority of Krieg's population at the time of the rebellion were victims, not perpetrators. They were ordinary citizens who were caught up in events beyond their control, who suffered and died in the nuclear fire and the 500-year civil war that followed, without ever having chosen to rebel. And the soldiers who bear the guilt today, the faceless, nameless soldiers who march into no man's land, wearing their ancestors' shame like a second skin, are even further removed from the original sin. Yet they are innocent. They have always been innocent. The debt they carry was never theirs, and the atonement they seek was never required. But no one has told them this. No one can tell them this, because the telling would destroy the system that has defined Krieg for 10 millennia. And without that system, the Death Cause would cease to exist, and without the Death Cause, the Imperium would lose one of its most valuable military assets. And in the grim darkness of the far future, military assets are worth more than moral truths. So the Death Cause march on, innocent and guilty in equal measure, heroic and tragic in the same breath. The most fanatical soldiers in a galaxy of fanatics, the most devoted servants of an emperor who may not even know they exist, are the most willing sacrifices in a universe that devours willing sacrifices with insatiable hunger and never, ever says thank you. They march, and they fight, and they die, and the galaxy turns, and the wars continue, and somewhere in the vast, cold darkness between the stars, the endless wheel of duty and atonement and sacrifice keeps spinning, carrying the death cause of Krieg forward into whatever battle comes next, whatever campaign demands their peculiar brand of devotion, whatever theatre of war requires soldiers who will not stop, will not break, will not flinch, will not question, and will not, under any circumstances, come home. This is their story. This is who they are. And if you have listened this far, if you have travelled with me through the nuclear fires of a world's destruction and the 500-year war that followed, through the culture of guilt and the training of death and the campaigns that have carried the Death Cause name across the galaxy, through the quiet moments of suppressed humanity and the grand themes that their existence illuminates, then you understand something about the Death Cause of Krieg that goes beyond the simple facts of their history and doctrine. You understand that they are more than just the most fanatical regiment in the Imperium. They are a mirror held up to the values that we take for granted, a question mark placed beside the virtues that we celebrate without examination, a reminder that the line between devotion and self-destruction is thinner than we like to believe, and that the cost of crossing it is measured not in bodies or in blood, but in the slow, quiet erosion of everything that makes us who we are. But the Death Cause of Krieg. Say the name one more time, feel the weight of it, and remember, if you can, that behind every gas mask and beneath every greatcoat, there is a human being who was never given the chance to be anything other than a weapon. A human being whose life was claimed before it began, whose identity was erased before it could form, whose potential was sacrificed on the altar of a guilt they did not earn and a debt they cannot pay. Remember them, because they will not remember themselves. And somewhere on a dead world that circles a dying star, the factories keep running, the children keep being born, the training keeps grinding on, and the next generation of Death Corps soldiers prepares for the long march toward a destiny that was chosen for them before they drew their first breath. The gas masks are fitted. The greatcoats are issued. The laser guns are checked and rechecked. The designations are assigned, numbers replacing names in the same way they have been replaced for 10,000 years. And the march begins again. The march always begins again. If you've made it this far, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for spending this time with me. The story of the Death Course of Krieg is one that I believe deserves this kind of deep exploration, because beneath the surface of a tabletop wargame lies something genuinely meaningful, a meditation on duty, sacrifice, identity, and the terrible price that fanaticism extracts from those who embrace it. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it made you feel something for those faceless soldiers in their gas masks and greatcoats, then I consider this time well spent. If you enjoyed this deep exploration of the Death Cause of Krieg, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. There are so many more stories in the Warhammer 40,000 universe that deserve this kind of attention. So many more corners of the lore that hold treasures waiting to be uncovered, and I want to bring them all to you. Drop a comment below and let me know which regiment, chapter, or faction you want me to cover next. Your suggestions fuel this channel, and I read every single one. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and remember, in the grim darkness of the far future, even the most expendable soldier carries a story worth telling. The Emperor protects.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.